In 1981, 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle lived on South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, south of Denver. She enjoyed studying history, especially researching the work of Wesley Quayle, a noted architect and Sylvia's uncle. Sylvia was able to incorporate her interest in architecture into her career, working as a secretary at an architectural firm. Sylvia was very artistic and ambitious, which led to her not being satisfied with just one job. She used her cooking and baking skills to start her own business, which specialized in creating wedding cakes. Her other artistic skills included making pottery, and she created pieces that are still treasured by her sister today. Sylvia was very close with her family, which included her parents and her younger sister. Her parents' home was only about 150 feet away from her own, and she had coffee with them every morning. Sylvia did not make it to this daily coffee date on August 4th, 1981. She was last heard from around 11 p.m. the night before, when she spoke to her sister on the phone. Just before 8 a.m. on the 4th, Sylvia's father, William, went over to her home. When William arrived at the home, the storm door and front door were both open, and he could see inside the living room from outside. His daughter's body was immediately visible on the floor. Sylvia was lying on the floor, her spread legs facing the door. She was nude from the neck up. Her red, long-sleeved shirt had been pulled up so it covered her face from the nose up, and her arms were still entangled in the garment above her head. A white towel had been thrown over her to cover the rest of her face and her neck. William quickly called for help, but he could not do so from Sylvia's house, as someone had cut the phone line inside the house, as well as pulled down the phone lines outside. William moved the towel on his daughter's face to try to cover up her body before police arrived. He told them how he originally found it, and they moved the towel back to its original position to properly document the scene. Sylvia had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and shot. Red marks approximately the size of fingers on her neck indicated that her killer also tried to strangle her. Extensive injuries to her hands and fingers showed that Sylvia had aggressively tried to fight off her attacker. Sylvia's cause of death was ultimately ruled to have been the blood loss caused by the 3 stab wounds she had sustained, which had pierced her heart and both of her lungs. The .22 caliber gunshot to the top of her head was ruled a secondary cause of her death. A bloody knife was found a few feet away from Sylvia's body, as was a pair of underwear. A small pool of blood was found behind the home's front door, and what court documents would later describe as a significant amount of blood was found on Sylvia's pillow in her bedroom. Drops of blood were found between the bed and the bedroom door. The killer appeared to have first attempted to enter the home through Sylvia's bedroom window, a conclusion authorities arrived at based on a hole cut into the lower corner of the window screen. Evidence indicated that the killer's successful entry into the home was made through the bathroom window. The screen from that window had been removed, and there was a pry mark visible at the bottom of the window. The screen was found 50 to 75 yards away from the house, tossed into tall weeds. Several items that were most likely from inside the bathroom, including a can of hairspray and 2 hair curlers, were found outside the home, underneath the bathroom window. Numerous items of evidence that would later be used to test for DNA were collected at the scene. These items included the bloody towel found covering the lower portion of Sylvia's face, the orange area rug upon which Sylvia's body had been lying, the knife, and the underwear found near her body. In addition, an internal vaginal swab and swabs from Sylvia's breasts were taken during her autopsy and preserved. In total, more than 140 pieces of evidence were collected and preserved in the case. New technologies were applied to the examination of this evidence as they were developed in the years following Sylvia's murder. In 1983, 2 years after Sylvia was killed, forensic technicians re-examined the carpet from her home with an alternative light source. When they did so, they were able to identify foreign biological evidence, in the area of the rug that was close to where Sylvia's body had been found. This section of carpet was submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for testing in 1995. 5 years later, in 2000, the CBI was able to develop a male DNA sample from the carpet. However, when they uploaded the profile to the FBI's Combined DNA Index system, the search returned no matches. In the early days of DNA testing by law enforcement, the technology had been used to discredit a confession from a known attention-seeking killer. In 1983, while he was imprisoned on unrelated charges, Otis Toole claimed to have killed Sylvia and reportedly described the hedges and bushes outside of her home to prove his involvement. Toole and his criminal associate, Henry Lee Lucas, famously claimed responsibility for hundreds of crimes committed across the country, apparently for the notoriety it afforded them and the benefits, like food and cigarettes, they received while working with various law enforcement agencies. Their claims have largely been disproven. Toole was eventually charged with Sylvia's murder, but in 1993, DNA from another piece of evidence excluded him as Sylvia's killer, and the charges were dropped. Toole died while incarcerated in Florida in 1996. In January of 2020, police in Cherry Hills Village began working with United Data Connect, a Colorado-based genetic genealogy company founded by former Denver District Attorney Mitch Morrissey. Using GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, two public genealogical databases, United Data Connect was able to provide police with the identity of someone who was a possible match to the DNA from the crime scene on May 26th of that same year. In addition to the genealogical evidence pointing to this individual, United Data Connect was also able to provide evidence that he had been living in the city of Englewood, just to the west of Cherry Hills Village, before, during, and after the time of Sylvia's murder. The potential suspect was living in Cozad, Nebraska at the time. In January of 2021, an investigator from United Data Connect traveled to Nebraska in hopes of surreptitiously collecting a sample of this individual's DNA. He retrieved 2 bags of trash from the dumpster of the apartment building where the potential suspect lived. The bags contained mail addressed to the potential suspect, indicating that he was the person who had owned the items in the bags. From the 2 bags of trash, the investigator was able to obtain 15 items that potentially had the possible suspect's DNA on them, and turn them over to the district attorney's office back in Colorado. The evidence was then taken to an evidence technician with the Cherry Hills Village Police Department. The items were submitted for testing, and a male DNA profile was developed from a can of vanilla Coke found in one of the bags of trash. It was a match to the DNA found on multiple pieces of evidence collected from Sylvia's body and her home following her murder. On February 10th, 2021, nearly 40 years after Sylvia was murdered, 62-year-old David Dwayne Anderson was arrested in Nebraska and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection to Sylvia's case. One count alleged that Sylvia was killed after deliberation, and the other alleged that she was killed during the commission of another felony. Anderson had been just 22 years old at the time of the murder. While he had never been arrested for violent crimes, he did have a criminal record. Between 1981 and 1986, he was arrested on 8 separate occasions for committing commercial and residential burglaries. During one of the residential burglaries, he had entered the home by discarding the screen to a bedroom window. Anderson agreed to an interview with investigators, during which he denied knowing Sylvia Quayle and stated that he did not know how his DNA ended up in her home. Anderson's first trial began in March of 2022. During opening statements, Anderson's defense team argued that he and Sylvia had consensual sex, explaining the presence of his semen on so many of the pieces of evidence from the scene. His DNA had been found in the swab taken from Sylvia's breast, and in the semen found in her vaginal swab, on the carpet near her body, and on the towel, which also contained Sylvia's blood that had been left on her face. The defense also suggested that the real killer was an abusive boyfriend of Sylvia's who had raped and beaten her several years before her murder. She had told her family at that time that if anything happened to her, he was responsible. Anderson's lawyers claimed that police had not taken the boyfriend seriously as a suspect, despite being told about him by a member of Sylvia's family. Sylvia had dated this man on and off for years, and they had begun seeing each other again several months before she was killed. The boyfriend's DNA was reportedly eventually found on a knife found in Sylvia's home, but not on the bloody knife found near her body. All of the foreign DNA samples found on or near Sylvia's body belonged to Anderson. There was no commingling of Anderson's DNA with any other individual, aside from Sylvia, whose blood was found on the towel that also contained Anderson's semen. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury announced that they could not reach a unanimous verdict, leading the presiding judge to declare a mistrial. A new trial was held just months later, in June of 2022. On June 30th, 2022, a jury found Anderson guilty of both counts of first-degree murder. Anderson is scheduled to be sentenced on August 4th. While current Colorado state law does not allow for parole following a conviction for first-degree murder, Anderson has to be sentenced under the guidelines in place at the time of the murder, meaning that even if he receives a life sentence, he will be eligible for parole after 20 years. Sylvia's parents did not live to see their daughter's killer identified and convicted. William Quayle passed away in 1999, and Mary Quayle passed away a decade later. Sylvia's sister and brother-in-law were able to finally learn who had taken Sylvia away from them more than 4 decades earlier. Following Anderson's conviction, District Attorney John Kellner stated, "This verdict should give hope to all those who are still waiting for justice, and for any killer who still thinks they got away. Know that we are still coming for you." Maureen Brubaker was born on July 4th, 1954, and everyone believed she would be a firecracker because of her patriotic birthday. This prediction would turn out to be accurate, with her mother Marianne later describing her as the wild child of the family. Maureen was the oldest of 7 children, and was a loyal and loving sister to her 4 brothers and 2 sisters. The earliest memory her sister Lisa, who is 13 years younger than Maureen, has is of sitting on Maureen's lap in a car, with Maureen's husband driving them around one night. Maureen was trying to teach her to sing the Christmas carol Silver Bells as they listened to it on the radio. Maureen would babysit her younger siblings for her parents, who knew that handling so many young children was a challenge, so they offered their younger children 10 cents each if they behaved for their sister while they were gone. Even if the younger children fought with each other or otherwise misbehaved, Maureen would always report to her parents that they had all behaved wonderfully for her when they returned home, so that all of her siblings would receive their dime. As close as she was with her family, Maureen was also somewhat of a typical teenager, in that she did not always listen to her parents or do what they thought was best. When she was 16, Maureen asked her parents if she could marry her boyfriend, David Farley. They told her they did not like the idea of her getting married, but Maureen and David married anyway. Maureen's parents could have asked the court to annul the marriage, but Maureen threatened to leave home and never speak to them again if they did, so they did not pursue that option. Shortly after the marriage, Maureen's husband David was arrested. Police have not publicly disclosed what he was charged with, but the Brubakers believe he was arrested for burglary. David was sent to the Anamosa State Penitentiary outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to serve his short sentence. Maureen moved to Cedar Rapids so she could visit her husband while he was incarcerated. Her younger siblings were upset by the move, as Cedar Rapids was on the opposite side of the state as their home in Sioux City. Maureen rented a room in Cedar Rapids and found a job nearby as a waitress at Wada's restaurant. She wrote letters and sent photos to her family regularly, and called them when she had the money to. On September 17, 1971, Maureen borrowed some money to buy a pack of cigarettes. Her paycheck from the restaurant would be ready later that day, so she would quickly be able to pay back the money. However, she never came to the restaurant that night to collect the paycheck she so desperately needed, as she was out of money. She likewise did not arrive at the restaurant for her shift on Monday the 20th, which was unusual for the dependable employee. Her co-workers were worried about her, so they went to her rented room to see if she was there. She was not, so they reported Maureen missing to the police. Police in Cedar Rapids contacted their counterparts in Sioux City to have them check if Maureen had simply gone to visit her family. When the police arrived at the Brubaker family home, they asked if Maureen was there and informed the family she was missing when they learned she was not at the house. Maureen's father was unable to get off work, and her mother had to stay to care for her youngest children, but 2 of Maureen's siblings made the 4-hour drive to Cedar Rapids to help look for her. Maureen would not be found until a week after she was last seen alive. On September 24, 1971, 2 teenage boys were out hunting in a wooded area, approximately 3 miles away from Maureen's rented room. In the bed of an abandoned truck in a wooded ravine near what was then a landfill, and is now Tate Cummins Park, they saw a woman lying down with one leg propped up. She was wearing clothes, but no shoes. The 2 boys assumed she was sleeping and continued on their way. When they passed by the area again, however, they noticed that the woman in the truck was in the exact same position she had been in when they saw her earlier. They decided to approach the truck to get a closer look. When they did, they saw that the woman's skin was discolored and realized she was dead. The woman in the truck was Maureen Brubaker Farley. She was just 17 years old at the time of her death. Maureen had been struck in the head, which had resulted in a severe skull fracture. Based on the level of decomposition, authorities believe Maureen had not died until several days after she sustained the injury. She would have been unconscious during the time between the injury and her death. There were also indications that she had been sexually assaulted. Police believed Maureen had been killed elsewhere and then later placed in the truck. When police began investigating the murder, they found no signs of struggle inside of Maureen's rented room, and her car was still parked outside. They conducted interviews, but were never able to make an arrest. Maureen's killer would remain unidentified for decades, until advances in science and technology provided new uses for evidence preserved in the case. In 2006, cold case investigators submitted a swab taken from Maureen's body to the lab to see if there was any unknown DNA present. A full DNA profile from an unknown male was developed from semen found on the swab, but there was no match to the profile in criminal databases. The case was looked at once again in 2017, and investigators began collecting DNA samples from suspects who had been identified in the early days of the investigation to compare their DNA to the DNA found on Maureen's body. More than 15 suspects were cleared through this effort. Police could not collect a DNA sample from one major suspect because he had died in 2013 at the age of 94. The man in question had worked at a liquor store near the restaurant where Maureen had worked and was a regular customer of hers there. He reportedly was friendly to her and offered to help her with her car. Maureen's mother, Marianne, had written to police 6 months after her daughter's murder, telling them that she believed he was the person who had killed Maureen. Police were also suspicious of this man. He had been interviewed extensively, but had refused to take a polygraph. He had continued to visit the police station in the months after Maureen's murder, asking about the investigation. Police found this suspicious, but had no evidence to show he was responsible for Maureen's murder. That changed in the spring of 2021, when police were able to obtain a search warrant, allowing them to collect a DNA sample from the man's daughter for comparison to the male DNA found on Maureen's body. The sample was collected and sent to the lab. On September 24, 2021, 50 years to the day after Maureen's body was discovered, police received the results of the analysis from the lab. Testing confirmed that the DNA found on Maureen's body had come from the father of the woman whose DNA had been submitted, the man the Brubaker family had long suspected, George M. Smith. Maureen's father passed away in 2002. Two of Maureen's brothers also passed away before learning who killed their sister. Maureen's mother and 4 surviving siblings are satisfied with the evidence and the formal closure of the case. While Smith may not have had to face justice in this life, Maureen's mother believes he will still face consequences, and is relieved she and her family have some measure of closure. "We just figure he'll suffer in hell for it," Marianne Brubaker told the Sioux City Journal. "What's done is done, and at least we know it was him, and we can quit wondering. We can let it go." Stephanie Isaacson was born on August 12, 1974, in Lincoln, Nebraska. However, her father John's military career resulted in her family moving to several different locations throughout her early life. In 1985, John was assigned to Nellis Air Force Base, and the family moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. Stephanie and her father were very close and spent a lot of time together due to their many shared interests. They both loved spending time outdoors. The pair enjoyed going hunting, boating, and camping together, and they rode both horses and motorcycles. They both received their scuba diving certification at Lake Mead. Stephanie's bond with her father was so close that when her parents divorced, she decided to live primarily with him, while her younger sister primarily stayed with their mother. Stephanie still regularly saw her mother and sister, and had a good relationship with them. John Isaacson worked nights as a staff sergeant at the Air Force Base, so he did not see his 14-year-old daughter leave their apartment for school on June 1st, 1989. At that time, he and Stephanie were less than a month away from moving to Spain for his next Air Force assignment. Stephanie's normal routine was to leave around 6:30 in the morning, walking to El Dorado High School via a shortcut through an empty desert field. That morning, she never arrived at school. The school did not call her father when she did not report to class. Her choir teacher was concerned when Stephanie did not eat lunch with her friends in her classroom that day. The group always spent their lunch break together and referred to themselves as the little team. The teacher was surprised to not see Stephanie that day, as it was unusual for her to miss school. Stephanie's father, John, grew concerned when his daughter did not arrive home from school that afternoon at her normal time. He called the school and finally learned that she had never made it to school that day. John then began calling some of Stephanie's friends, none of whom had any idea where she was. John's next call was to the police to report Stephanie missing. John then went to the Air Force Base with some of his friends to pick up horses from the base's stables. They rode the horses around the small area of desert between the high school and the apartment that Stephanie could have walked through that day. During their search, one of John's friends spotted a trail of school books in a lot half a mile from the apartment building where the Isaacsons lived. John confirmed that the books belonged to his daughter, and they notified authorities of what they had found. A massive air and ground search was carried out in the area. Around 11 o'clock that night, the search came to an end. Stephanie's body was discovered approximately 25 yards off of a path she would walk to and from school. A police dog found her amongst the brush, hidden under a discarded piece of orange carpet. When Stephanie's body was found, the black shirt she had been wearing had been pulled up, and her jeans had been pulled down. Her hair was in disarray, and her left breast had been mutilated. During her autopsy, it was determined that she had been sexually assaulted. It appeared that Stephanie had been abruptly attacked by surprise as she walked to school, before being dragged off the path, leaving behind the trail of her books and other belongings. Her autopsy found that she had suffered severe blunt force trauma injuries and had died as the result of strangulation. 2 memorial services were held for Stephanie, one in Las Vegas and one in Nebraska, where she was buried. Police followed up on what few potential leads they had early on in the investigation. Local residents reported seeing a vehicle parked in the area the day of Stephanie's murder, but they provided different descriptions of what it looked like. As years went on without an arrest, investigators traveled all over the United States to follow up on potential leads and possible suspects. In 1998, the evidence from Stephanie's case was re-examined in hopes of locating DNA evidence. The effort was unsuccessful. In 2007, using more advanced technology, the forensic laboratory was able to identify DNA in semen found on the shirt Stephanie had been wearing at the time of her murder. Despite ongoing advances in forensic science, a match to the DNA could not be found in the ensuing years. In 2020, a $5,000 donation was made to Othram, a Texas-based laboratory specializing in advanced DNA technology. The donation was made to help solve a cold case, with the donor specifying that the case in question must be one from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Stephanie's case was selected by the department's cold case unit, not only because of her young age at the time of her murder and the brutality of the crime, but also because there was very little DNA evidence available for analysis, meaning investigators had to rely on Othram's advanced techniques to process the small sample. Othram used their forensic-grade genome sequencing to create a genealogical profile from the provided sample. Genealogists began constructing a family tree and provided leads to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. From there, the department identified 2 potential suspects. A DNA profile was on file for one of them, and in 2021, comparison of it to the sample from Stephanie's shirt showed that he was a match. In identifying the contributor of the DNA, Othram set the record for the smallest amount of DNA used to build a genealogical profile and solve a case. Police in Las Vegas had provided them with 0.12 nanograms of DNA, or approximately 15 human cells. For comparison, commercial DNA sites like Ancestry.com or 23andMe use at least 750 nanograms of DNA to construct their customers' DNA profiles. The smallest amount of DNA Othram had previously been able to use was in August of 2020, when they used 1/5 of a nanogram, or approximately 20 cells, to identify Rodney Johnson, previously only known as the Lake Stickney John Doe. On July 21, 2021, 32 years after Stephanie was killed, authorities announced that her killer had been identified as Darren Roy Marchand. Unfortunately, he could not be arrested or tried for Stephanie's murder. The DNA sample on file that had confirmed that he was a match to the DNA from the crime scene had been taken following his suicide in 1995. That son of a bitch got me twice. Once when he killed my daughter, and the other one when I didn't get the opportunity to look him in the eye, Stephanie's father John told the Las Vegas Review-Journal after Marchand was identified. In March of 1986, when he was just 20 years old, Marchand had been charged with the murder of 24-year-old Nanette Vandenberg. Her nude body was found in the bathtub of her Las Vegas apartment. Marchand's fingerprints had been found near her body, and he had been with her at a casino just before her death. Marchand denied involvement in the murder, stating that he had left Nanette alive at her apartment before going home to go to sleep. The murder charge against Marchand did progress to a preliminary hearing, but the case was dismissed after 2 days of testimony, after it was ruled that the fingerprint evidence was not enough to charge him with Nanette's murder. After DNA tied Marchand to Stephanie's murder, authorities compared his DNA profile to DNA evidence from Nanette's murder and found it to be a match. Marchand got married in January of 1987, less than a year after Nanette was murdered. At the time of Stephanie's murder in June of 1989, he and his wife had a 2-year-old daughter and were expecting a son. In January of 1989, Marchand was charged with 5 counts of open and gross lewdness. Each count was in relation to a different woman to whom Marchand publicly exposed himself. That April, Marchand pled guilty to one of the counts in exchange for the other 4 being dropped. He was awaiting sentencing when Stephanie was killed. In August, he was sentenced to a maximum of 1 year of probation, which he was released from after just 9 months. Marchand and his wife divorced in 1990. He committed suicide in the Las Vegas area just weeks before his 30th birthday in 1995. When Marchand's identification was first announced, the individual who provided the funds for the testing in Stephanie's case was initially only identified as an anonymous donor. He was subsequently identified as entrepreneur and philanthropist Justin Wu. After moving to Las Vegas from Los Angeles, he established the nonprofit Vegas Helps. He contacted Othram about expanding his efforts to benefit the Las Vegas community by solving cold cases after taking a personal interest in advanced forensic DNA testing. In November of 2021, another donation from Mr. Wu led to the identification of Johnny Blake Peterson as the killer of 16-year-old Kim Bryant. Kim went missing on January 26, 1979. She had last been seen in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant near her high school. Her body was located a month later, and it was determined that her killer had sexually assaulted her. Othram tied Peterson to the murder using DNA taken from Kim's body. Just days later, Peterson was tied to another decades-old case. His DNA was also a match to DNA collected from the body of Diana Hansen. 22-year-old Diana was a college student who had returned home for winter break at the end of 1983. She went out for a run around 4:30 p.m. on December 30th and never returned home. Her body was later found on Spring Mountain Road, west of South Buffalo Drive in Las Vegas. She had been sexually assaulted. Peterson died in 1993, so he could not be charged with either of the murders. Mr. Wu has formed the Las Vegas Justice League to provide further support and funding to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. As of late 2021, the League is looking into assisting with at least 8 other cold cases in the Las Vegas area. While the solving of Stephanie's case was appreciated by her family, it of course did not diminish the pain caused by her loss. It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. Stephanie's mother wrote in a statement read at the press conference announcing Marchand's identification, "We will never have complete closure, because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us." In July of 1991, 17-year-old Patricia Moreno, known to her loved ones as Tricia, was in the care of the Department of Social Services. She had been living in one of their foster homes on Henry Street in Malden, Massachusetts, for the past 2 months. Tricia's foster mother did not allow smoking inside the home, so Tricia would often go out onto the third-floor apartment's fire escape to smoke cigarettes. The fire escape is where Tricia would be found at approximately 3 a.m. on July 20th, having been shot in the head. Tricia was rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital, where she died as a result of her injuries 12 hours later. An arrest in Tricia's case would not be made for 30 years. On September 29, 2021, Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan announced that a grand jury had returned an indictment for first-degree murder, and that 48-year-old Rodney Daniels of South Fulton, Georgia, had been charged in connection with Tricia's murder. He had been arrested without incident at his home in Georgia on September 27th and would be extradited back to Massachusetts. Daniels had been dating one of the 2 teenage daughters of Tricia's foster mother and sometimes stayed at their apartment. In 1991, he told police that he had been asleep on an armchair in the apartment's living room when he was awoken by 2 gunshots. He went out onto the fire escape, where he found Tricia, critically injured. Tricia's foster mother then called 911. Police learned that Daniels had been aggressive and threatening towards Tricia during her time in the foster home. According to court documents, Tricia had reported that she had awoken one night shortly before her death to Daniels standing in her bedroom. He had a gun in his hand, which he then pointed at Tricia's head. Tricia's foster mother never reported this to the police or to the Department of Social Services. These same documents detail accounts of Daniels bragging about the police failing to find gunpowder residue on him, and telling Tricia's foster mother, "Yes, you can," after she said that a person could not get away with murder. Police were able to confirm that Daniels had been in possession of multiple handguns prior to Tricia's murder. In 2020, Tricia's case was re-examined by the Middlesex District Attorney's Office Cold Case Unit, which had been formed the year before. They returned to the apartment where Tricia had been killed and meticulously recreated the crime scene. They determined, based on the angle of the bullet that killed Tricia, that her killer had fired the fatal shot near the door back into the apartment she had been living in. In addition, investigators were able to locate a witness who had just returned to the United States after an extended period of time outside of the country. He had lived in a second-floor apartment in 1991 and had been awoken by the gunshots when Tricia was killed. Because of the location of his bed in his bedroom and the location of his window, when he woke up, he was looking directly out at the crime scene. He was able to provide police with a description of the man out on the fire escape with Tricia, and, more importantly, he reported that he had seen the man go inside of Tricia's apartment after the shooting. There had been no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and no one who had been known to be inside of the apartment had reported seeing anyone else there. Tricia's foster sister, Chantel, who had been dating Daniels at the time of the murder, testified on his behalf at a 1991 grand jury hearing. However, in private, she told her younger sister Rochelle that on the night of the murder, Daniels had confessed to her that he had killed Tricia, and then hid the gun in a hole in the chair where he slept in the living room. He told her later he had gotten rid of the weapon. Rochelle had begged Chantel to go to the police with this information throughout the years that followed, but Chantel never would. She feared getting into legal trouble for lying to the grand jury to protect Daniels originally. Chantel died of COVID-19 in 2020, and Rochelle told police about what Chantel had told her about the murder and her dishonesty during a 2021 interview with them, since Chantel could no longer face any legal consequences. Daniels was arraigned in Middlesex Superior Court on September 30th. He is being held without bail. Rita Curran loved to sing and shared her love of music with her family. She was a beloved second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School in Milton, Vermont, when she was off from her full-time job for summer breaks. Rita also worked part-time as a maid at the South Burlington Colonial Motor Inn. 24-year-old Rita remained living at home with her parents and siblings, even after she began working full-time. That changed in the summer of 1971, however, when Rita saw an advertisement for a room that was for rent for the summer in an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont. After deciding she was a good fit with the potential roommates, Rita decided to move in for the summer. She shared one room with a young woman named Beverly, and a couple, Carrie and Paul, lived in the apartment's other bedroom. On July 19, 1971, Rita had only been living in the apartment for 2 weeks. That night, her roommates Carrie and Paul went out to dinner, and then went to a bar called the Harbor Hideaway. Around 11:15, they called their apartment to see if their roommates wanted to join them for a drink. Beverly answered the phone and told them she would meet them there. She did not invite Rita because she was already asleep. Beverly left the apartment at 11:20 p.m. Paul and Carrie returned home at 12:30 a.m. on July 20th, and Beverly arrived shortly thereafter. When Beverly entered her bedroom, she discovered Rita's body and called out to her roommates for help. Rita had been viciously attacked. Her autopsy found that she had been severely beaten, raped, and then strangled to death. She had fought fiercely against her killer. She appeared to have been asleep at the time the attack began, as she had curlers in her hair and was surrounded by scraps of her clothing, including her nightgown. All of her clothes had been ripped from her body during the attack. Based on her roommate's movements, it was determined that the window of time during which the murder occurred was just 70 minutes. Police collected evidence, followed up on leads, and interviewed neighbors. No arrests were made. Authorities later actively investigated the possibility that serial killer Ted Bundy was Rita's murderer. He had been actively killing at the time of her murder, and the motel where Rita worked was next to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, where Bundy had been born. Rita's sister Mary even wrote to Bundy, asking him if he had been involved in Rita's murder. No evidence was ever found tying Bundy to the crime, and 45 minutes prior to his execution in 1989, when asked if he had ever killed anyone in Vermont, Bundy said no. Decades would pass, but police interest in solving the case did not diminish. In 2014, authorities in Vermont went out of state for help in processing evidence from the scene. The New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner processed evidence looking for DNA. While the slides made from vaginal swabs taken during Rita's autopsy were too degraded to identify DNA, they were able to sequence a male DNA profile from a cigarette butt that had been found next to Rita's body. It would later be determined that this profile was a match to DNA also found on Rita's nightgown. However, there was not a match to the profile in any criminal database. Rita's case was reopened in 2019, and instead of having one investigator working on the case, as was protocol for cold cases, an entire team was assigned to investigate her murder. Genetic genealogy was used to identify relatives of the man whose DNA was found at the crime scene. In combing through their family trees, investigators came across the name of someone who had been interviewed about the case back in 1971. This man had since died, but he had a half-brother living in Alabama who agreed to provide a sample of his DNA. This sample confirmed that this man's half-brother was the contributor of the DNA that was found at the crime scene. On February 21st, 2023, Burlington police announced that they had identified the suspect in Rita's case as William DeReaux. DeReaux and his wife had lived in the same building as Rita, 2 floors above her apartment. Shortly after Rita's murder, DeReaux had moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. He and his wife divorced after not seeing each other for some time. DeReaux eventually moved back to the United States and remarried. He died of a drug overdose in San Francisco in 1986. An informant had identified DeReaux as a potential suspect early on in the investigation. However, when police interviewed his wife Michelle, she said that her husband had been with her at the time of the murder. When she was re-interviewed 50 years later, Michelle admitted that DeReaux had not been with her. He had argued with her that night and then gone out for a walk to cool off. Because they lived in Rita's building, police had notified DeReaux and his wife of the murder the morning after it occurred. According to Michelle, as soon as he closed the door, her husband had turned to her and told her to say she had been with him all night if police asked her any questions. Therefore, when she was formally interviewed by police, Michelle provided her husband with an alibi. Police do not believe Michelle knew her husband killed Rita. They view her dishonesty as the result of her being coerced by her husband, rather than as her being a willing accomplice in covering up his crime. DeReaux did have a history of manipulating women and went on to commit acts of domestic violence and violence against women. He once strangled his second wife until she became unconscious, and on another occasion, he stabbed one of her friends, seemingly at random. Rita's parents passed away before DeReaux was identified, but her brother and sister did get to learn who took their beloved sister from them. While DeReaux cannot be prosecuted for the murder, investigators say they are unanimously certain that he killed Rita, and the case is now closed. On Thursday, June 9th, 1977, 17-year-old Eric Goldstrand and 16-year-old lliana adank went out for a day of fishing and swimming at the Broken Bowl picnic grounds near Fall Creek, Oregon. The high school sweethearts were on summer break from North Eugene High School in Eugene, Oregon, where they each had a close group of friends. The couple drove east on Highway 58 in Eric's truck, with the picnic lunch Eric's mother had prepared for them. The couple was supposed to be home by 10 o'clock that night, but they did not arrive as scheduled. Earlier in the evening, Eric had called home to tell his father he was having problems with the truck. He asked him to come looking for him if he and lliana did not arrive home on time. Eric's parents, Ted and Donna, therefore then drove out to the picnic area. There, they located the truck, but not Eric and lliana. Their clothes were inside of the truck, so Ted and Donna knew that wherever their son and his girlfriend were, they were only dressed in their swimsuits. Eric's parents then notified law enforcement and a Lane County Sheriff's deputy arrived on the scene to help search for the 2 missing teenagers. The deputy and Ted went out to search, while Donna stayed behind with the truck. They located Lliana's body in a secluded area within the picnic grounds. She had been raped and then shot. Ted took Donna home for the evening, telling her the search would resume in the morning. He did not tell her that Lliana had been found dead, and that the picnic area was now a crime scene. The next morning, Eric's parents were notified that Eric's body had also been found, several hours after Lliana was located. His body was found in a group of bushes, and he had also been shot. An extensive investigation was launched to find Lliana and Eric's killer. A massive search was held, and roadblocks went up throughout the area in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Numerous interviews were performed, and polygraph examinations were administered. Several bullets and suspect firearms were examined. Fingerprints were found at the scene, but at the time, no match could be found to them. Despite ongoing efforts, no arrests were made in the case. Detective Ken West was first assigned to work Lliana and Eric's case in 1983. He later retired and began volunteering 1 day a week with the Lane County Sheriff's Office cold case team, working alongside Chuck Tilby, who had retired after 3 decades with the Eugene Police Department, and Kirk Engdahl, a retired state and federal prosecutor. DNA evidence had been found and preserved at the crime scene, but there was little investigators could do with it in 1977. Decades later, however, this would be the evidence that finally identified the young couple's killer. In July of 2020, the DNA from the scene was run again, and Parabon Nanolabs was brought in to analyze the profile. They were able to generate an image of what the killer may have looked like based on his DNA. They also used genetic genealogy to try to identify him based on his relatives. They ultimately determined that the killer was most likely one of 3 members of a family from Oak Ridge, Oregon. Only one of these family members was still local. Investigators were able to surreptitiously collect the butt of a cigarette he had smoked, and the DNA found on it eliminated him as a suspect. This left 2 brothers, who were then living in Mesa, Arizona, as potential suspects. Authorities in Oregon began arranging to collect their DNA and bring the case to a grand jury once they conclusively determined which brother was their suspect. However, on February 24, 2021, the 2 brothers got into an altercation. The younger of the brothers was injured during the fight, and the police were called. Before they arrived on the scene, the older brother took his own life. While he will never know for sure, Kurt West suspects that the older brother may have ended his life rather than come in contact with the police, in part because his involvement in Lliana and Eric's murders, and the DNA he had left at the scene, may have still been at the back of his mind. The surviving brother cooperated with police, answering questions about his older brother. Delays in the final DNA testing went on for months, but on September 23, 2021, more than 44 years after Lliana and Eric were killed, the Lane County Sheriff's Office announced that the DNA found at the crime scene belonged to Ronald Albert Schroy. Schroy had been 23 years old at the time of the murders and had recently been discharged from the military. He was a Lane County resident in 1977, but left Oregon in the early 1980s, eventually moving to Mesa in 2008. It's a relief he's not going to be able to hurt anyone again, but there's a part of us who wanted to see him and know why, and all these things we're never going to know, Lliana's cousin, Kathy Kloster, said after Schroy's identification. Eric's mother, Donna, does see a silver lining in Schroy's suicide, as she was terrified of having to go through a trial, and what could happen if Schroy somehow managed to get acquitted. The DNA testing performed in the case by the Cold Case Unit was funded with donations made to the unit by the public. Lliana and Eric's families are grateful to the investigators who never gave up on the case. They hope the resolution of the case will give hope to other families still waiting for answers in cold cases, and serve as a reminder to criminals that while they may not have been caught yet, they may still one day have police come knocking on their door. Sarah Mobley Hall experienced loss early in life, but it only made her more dedicated to helping others. She was raised by her grandmother, because her mother died shortly after the birth of Sarah's sister Mary. According to Mary, Sarah treated her as though she were her own child, and always had faith in her. Sarah was very outgoing, and well-liked by those who knew her. In 1984, 27-year-old Sarah was a single mother living in the Hidden Valley neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. She worked with children with special needs, like her son, 10-year-old Derrick Mobley. Derrick had a jovial personality and was very close with his mother. On March 14, 1984, police were called to Sarah and Derrick's apartment, which was in a complex on Ventura Way. They had been called because the door to the apartment was open, and a foul odor was coming from inside the home. When police entered the apartment, they discovered the bodies of both Sarah and Derrick. They had both been strangled, and Sarah had also been badly beaten. Sarah's sister Mary worked near Sarah's apartment and spent a lot of time at the home with her sister and nephew. "I carried a burden for years because I felt like I should have been with her," Mary later said. "It would have never happened if I was with her." Decades would pass before an arrest was made in the case. Finally, on February 1, 2023, 60-year-old James Thomas Pratt was arrested without incident in York County, South Carolina. He was extradited back to North Carolina to be charged with Sarah and Derrick's murders. While he does have a criminal record, he's only ever been charged with minor misdemeanors. He lived in the same neighborhood as Sarah and Derrick at the time they were killed, and is believed to have had a friendly relationship with them. It was DNA that finally led to Pratt's arrest. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Administration, which allowed them to use new technology in the investigation. DNA was found on the pillow Sarah's body had been found resting on, but there was no match to the profile in criminal databases. Investigators then attempted to use forensic genetic genealogy in the case, looking in commercial DNA databases for relatives of the contributor of the DNA found at the crime scene. This effort did not identify a potential suspect. They then partnered with state police to use familial DNA technology. Instead of using commercial DNA sites, this technique involved searching the state criminal DNA database, looking for people who were related to the individual whose DNA was found on the pillow. This effort is what ultimately led to Pratt being identified as a potential suspect. Police then worked with the FBI to obtain a sample of Pratt's DNA, which proved to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene. According to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, this is the first time familial DNA has been used to solve a murder in the state of North Carolina. The technology was previously used in the state to make an arrest in a previously unsolved rape case and to identify a John Doe in 2022. Pratt is currently being held at the Mecklenburg County Jail. After Pratt's arrest, Sarah's sister Mary said, "I'm so grateful the police have found this person, and I hope he spends the rest of his days behind bars." Wilhelmina Filkins, who went by Violet, came from a large family, growing up with 7 sisters and a brother. She never married or had children of her own, and in 1994, she was 81 years old and living alone in a ground-floor apartment in East Greenbush, New York. She retired after a long career with the State Department of Education, but remained active. Despite her age and the fact that she did have a car, she made almost daily walks to a local convenience store, where the employees were fond of her, to buy grocery items. She loved to garden and volunteered often. She was a quiet woman who lived a simple life, attending Mass regularly and always keeping her weekly hair appointment. She was close with her family and friends, and her neighbors all liked her. Violet was last seen alive on Wednesday, August 17, 1994. 2 days later, on August 19th, her brother Sterling and her niece Carol went to her apartment to check on her. They realized that something was amiss before they even reached the apartment. They noticed that the curtains were caught in the apartment's sliding glass door, which meant the door could not be locked, as Violet normally kept it. When they opened the door, they discovered Violet's body lying close to it. Violet had been beaten severely about the head. Her 1989 Plymouth Reliant was located at the apartment complex, but was not found in the manner Violet usually parked it. Police believed that Violet was killed during a daytime robbery, and that her killer had used her vehicle to transport items stolen from her home, before returning it to her apartment complex. Her killer did not appear to profit very much from the robbery and murder, as it is believed he disposed of many of the stolen items right after killing Violet. The items were found abandoned behind a local cemetery 3 years after Violet was killed. An arrest was not immediately made, despite the best efforts of investigators. In the following years, the case was investigated by numerous law enforcement agencies, including the State Police Troop G Major Crimes Unit, the Bureau of Criminal Investigations Unit at the State Police Barracks, and the East Greenbush Police Department. However, it would be more than 28 years before the case was finally closed. On January 19, 2023, police announced that they had identified the man they believed killed Violet. His name was Jeremiah Guyette, and he had been 18 years old at the time of the murder. He had been living in the same apartment complex as Violet when she was killed, in a unit he shared with his father, just around the corner from where Violet lived. He had been interviewed about the case in 1994, when police canvassed the neighborhood, but was not considered a suspect at the time. He went on to serve in the Air Force and live in Florida, before returning to upstate New York, where he worked as a bus driver, transporting both children and the elderly. Unfortunately, Guyette could not be prosecuted for Violet's murder. Investigators had identified him as a potential suspect in 2019. They went to see him on October 1st of that year. When they told him they wanted to speak with him about an incident that had taken place 25 years earlier, he immediately became visibly upset. He told the investigators that he would not speak to them without an attorney present, and they left. The next day, police came to the home after receiving a report of a shot being fired there. Guyette had shot himself in the head. He did not survive. A relative later told police that Guyette had called them after investigators came to see him and stated that he did not want to go to prison. Guyette had been brought to investigators' attention by one of his ex-girlfriends. In 2009, he made statements to her while crying, like, "That poor old woman, I robbed her, I hit her, and I just left her there." She did not think anything of these statements until 2019, when she was watching programming about cold cases on Netflix. She did some research and found out that an old woman, Violet, had been robbed and killed while Guyette was living near her. She then went to the authorities with this information. Guyette's DNA and fingerprints were taken during his autopsy, but due to a backlog of cases at the lab and the pandemic, it was years before they were analyzed. When the evidence was finally examined, Guyette's left thumbprint was matched to a print taken from Violet's coffee table. According to police, at the time of the murder, Guyette had plans to steal a car and rob a bank in order to pay for college. Violet's family is grateful to finally have the answers they feared they might never receive. Sarah Yarborough had bright red hair and an ever-present smile. She loved her 2 younger brothers and regularly helped them with their homework. Sarah was very well-rounded, with both a love of the arts and a knack for math and science. She had big dreams from a young age, and the work ethic she would need to achieve them. Her mother, Laura, described Sarah as the delight of her life, and said of her, "She made those of us around her better. She was a person who built bridges and brought people together, but in her own quiet way." The Yarboroughs had moved to Federal Way, Washington, when Sarah was 8 years old. In December of 1991, 16-year-old Sarah was a junior at Federal Way High School. She excelled academically and was an honors student. She had a very active social life, despite juggling academics and extensive extracurricular activities. Sarah had a few close friends, but often socialized in a large group because she was friendly to everyone and attracted friends with her caring and energetic personality. The Yarboroughs were members of Bible Baptist Church, and Sarah was an active member of the church youth group. Sarah loved dance and said it made her feel fully alive. She was a member of the Safety Kids, a dance group that gave performances encouraging young people not to abuse drugs or alcohol. In the summer of 1990, she had traveled to New Zealand to perform with the group. Sarah was also a member of her school's drill team. Her dedication to the team was one of the reasons she asked her parents if she could stay home while the family went out of town on Friday, December 13th, 1991. They were traveling to Ocean Shores, some 2 hours away from their home, because one of Sarah's brothers was playing a soccer game there. Sarah had plans all weekend, including an important drill team competition, so she asked to stay behind. Her parents were reluctant to leave their teenager home alone, but ultimately agreed to let her stay under the condition that a friend come to stay with her on Friday night. Sarah spent the night of Friday the 13th at a basketball game with a group of friends. She and the friend, who would be sleeping over at Sarah's house, stopped for fast food and snacks on the way back to Sarah's house. When Sarah woke up the next morning, on December 14th, 1991, she thought she was running late for her drill team competition. She said goodbye to her friend and rushed out of the house, with curlers still in her hair, to drive to school to meet up with the rest of the team, to board a bus to travel to Juanita High School in Kirkland for the competition. 13-year-old Drew Miller had also had a sleepover on the night of December 13th. His friend Adam spent the night at his house, and the two boys spent the morning of December 14th watching Saturday morning cartoons and eating cereal, before heading out to go skateboarding in the parking lot of a nearby Albertsons grocery store. Adam lived down the road from Federal Way High School and regularly jumped over a fence so he could cut through the school's campus to get to the Albertsons. He and Adam followed that routine that morning. Because it was so cold, puddles had frozen over, so the two boys stomped on the ice to break it as they made their way across the school grounds. When Drew looked up ahead, he saw a man come out of the bushes and start walking in the same direction he and Adam were traveling. He tried to tell himself that the man had just hidden in the bushes to smoke marijuana without being seen, but his presence still unnerved him, so he kept an eye on him as he and Adam kept walking. When Drew and Adam reached the spot where they had initially seen the man pop up from the bushes, they found something horrifying. A young woman, partially clothed, staring up at them, unmoving. When they looked back up, they saw the man up ahead, standing near a vehicle, staring them down. The two boys turned and ran back to Drew's house. His mother called 911, while his stepfather rushed back to the scene with Drew to see if they could help the young woman. When they arrived, they confirmed that there was nothing they could do to help her. She was soon identified as Sarah Yarborough. It turned out that Sarah had been wrong about the time she needed to be at school to catch the bus to the competition, and had actually arrived at the school early. A witness saw her pull into the school's parking lot around 8:10 a.m., but members of the drill team did not need to be there until 9. Her body had been found between 100 and 150 yards away from her car. There was no obvious reason why she would have gone down to the area, which was covered in bushes. There were also no signs of a struggle in or near her vehicle, where a large jug of orange juice Sarah had brought with her sat unspilled on the front passenger seat. Because Sarah was always willing to help anyone, including strangers, it was theorized early on that someone may have approached her asking for assistance, and she walked away from her vehicle trying to help them with something. Sarah's cause of death was found to be ligature strangulation, and her own nylon stockings were found around her neck. Police believed Sarah's murder had been sexually motivated, as semen was found on her clothing. DNA from it would eventually be found to be a match to DNA found under Sarah's fingernails, and on the nylons used to strangle her. Early on in the investigation, the most important lead police had was the two boys, Adam and Drew, who had seen a man leaving the scene just after Sarah was killed. The two boys were able to work with a sketch artist to produce an image of what the man looked like, which they said was highly accurate. The sketch was posted all over town and generated thousands of calls to police, none of which led to an arrest. In June of 1993, a memorial to Sarah was dedicated in the courtyard of Federal Way High School. The stone bench was inscribed with Sarah's life motto, Carpe Diem, which means seize the day, and featured a bronze statue representing some of the things Sarah loved the most: her ballet shoes, books, and her dog Gibby. June 12, 1993 was graduation day at Federal Way High School. It also would have been Sarah's 18th birthday. Sarah had dreamed of going to a college somewhere far away from Washington to explore somewhere new. She hadn't fully settled on a career path, but was considering becoming a museum curator or an engineer, like her father. Sarah's mother, Laura, did not sit at home with her own pain on that day, instead going to the graduation ceremony to support Sarah's many friends, as Sarah would have wanted. Years passed without answers in Sarah's case, but they also brought new technology and new avenues of investigation. In December of 2011, Sarah's case made history in a field which would eventually solve her case. While other cases would be solved using consumer DNA databases and genetic genealogy before Sarah's killer was identified, Sarah's case is believed to be the first cold case to find a lead by searching consumer DNA databases. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifiers International was not able to identify a potential suspect by comparing the DNA from Sarah's crime scene to the DNA profiles available in commercial databases at the time. However, she also used YSTR analysis, which looks at the Y chromosome and therefore male lineage. A match was found and showed that Sarah's killer was a descendant of Robert Fuller, who lived in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1630s and whose family arrived in North America on the Mayflower. Because they shared a Y chromosome, the killer had to be a direct male descendant of Robert Fuller. The chromosome had been passed from father to son since the 17th century until Sarah's killer inherited it. Given the number of generations who had lived and died since Robert Fuller's lifetime, this still left thousands of potential suspects. The surname of Fuller did have a connection to Sarah's case. Bill Fuller was a close family friend of the Yarboroughs. He had led the effort to have the memorial to her installed at Federal Way High School. While he did not match the description of the man the two boys who found Sarah's body saw leaving the scene, police still requested that he provide a sample of his DNA, which he willingly did. It was not a match to the crime scene DNA. However, his Y chromosome was a match to the crime scene DNA and the known Fuller family, who arrived on the Mayflower. Bill Fuller was a paternal cousin of the killer, but too distant of one to identify him. Other individuals with the surname of Fuller living in the area were investigated, but not tied to Sarah's murder. Genetic genealogy continued to be utilized in the case, and in 2019, it finally narrowed down the potential suspect pool to two brothers, either of which could have been the killer based on their DNA. However, one of the brothers was then excluded because his DNA profile was already in the criminal database and found not to be a match. Police began surveilling the other brother and collected 2 cigarette butts and a napkin he discarded. A DNA profile was developed from these items. It was found to be a match to the DNA collected from Sarah's body. On October 3, 2019, a first-degree murder charge was filed against 55-year-old Patrick Leon Nicholas. The filing documents alleged that Nicholas killed Sarah while committing, or attempting to commit, the crime of rape in the 2nd degree. Nicholas was booked into King County Jail the same day, with prosecutors requesting his bail be set at $5 million. Nicholas did not have the surname of Fuller despite being of direct male Fuller genetic lineage, as had been previously predicted, because his grandfather had been adopted. Nicholas did have a disturbing criminal history. In June of 1983, he had attacked a young woman named Ann Croney as she sat outside of her car overlooking the Columbia River in Richland, Washington. After making small talk with her for a few minutes, he held a knife to her throat as she attempted to leave. He forced her to remove her clothing and walk down closer to the river. Anne was able to escape by jumping into the water and swimming away. Nicholas then bought a plane ticket, but was identified and arrested before he could leave town. Nicholas was only 19 years old at the time of his attack on Anne, but he had been convicted of 2 rapes and an attempted rape as a juvenile. In these cases, he had used the threat of violence to get his victims away from where he first interacted with them, into a more remote area where he raped them, much like he had attempted to do to Anne. He had been released from custody for his most recent crime just a few months before he attempted to rape Anne. He pled guilty to 1 charge of first-degree attempted rape in Anne's case, and she spoke at his sentencing hearing. She requested that the judge sentence Nicholas to the maximum sentence. The judge did so, sentencing Nicholas to 10 years in prison. However, Nicholas was released after serving just 3.5 years of his 10-year sentence. Had he served his entire sentence, he would have still been incarcerated at the time of Sarah Yarborough's murder. 2 years after Sarah was murdered, at the end of 1993, he was arrested again. This time, he was charged with molesting his 6-year-old stepdaughter. Nicholas was ultimately able to plead the charges against him down to just 1 4th-degree assault charge. Despite the nature of his criminal history, Nicholas's DNA was never entered into any criminal database. According to state law, his DNA should have been entered into the combined DNA index system following the 1993 molestation arrest, but since he was able to plead down to a gross misdemeanor, he also avoided having to fulfill this requirement. That being said, it would have still been possible for Nicholas to have been identified using DNA more than a decade before he was finally arrested, were it not for limitations in place in the state of Washington. Numerous other states, as well as the United Kingdom, allow law enforcement to utilize familial DNA analysis in their investigations. The legal statutes of the state of Washington do not allow for such analysis to be utilized there. Familial DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, the process which ultimately identified Nicholas, involve essentially the same process, but they are considered 2 separate investigative techniques because of one major difference. Both techniques involve comparing a DNA profile from a crime scene to other DNA profiles in a database. Investigators identify individuals who share DNA with the suspect DNA, and then work to determine how they are related based on how much DNA they share. In the majority of cases, only distant cousins are identified, meaning investigators have to use records to construct the family trees of these individuals in order to narrow down their suspect pool. The difference between investigative genetic genealogy and familial DNA analysis is that the former uses databases of customers of commercial DNA sites, who generally use these services to explore their ancestry or find long-lost relatives, and the latter uses criminal databases. In what is perhaps the most famous use of familial DNA analysis, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the so-called Grim Sleeper, was identified because his son Christopher's DNA had been entered into the criminal database following a weapons charge and showed up as a partial match to DNA from the Grim Sleeper investigation. Patrick Nicholas has an older brother, Edward Peter Nicholas Jr., who is a convicted rapist and registered sex offender. His DNA was entered into the combined DNA index system in October of 2005, 14 years before Sarah Yarborough's case had been solved. Had familial DNA analysis been available to investigators working on Sarah's case, Patrick Nicholas would have been identified as a suspect in her case essentially instantaneously, according to investigators, because of how closely he was related to someone in the criminal database. Because familial searches are not performed by the Washington State Patrol crime labs, Patrick Nicholas remained free for 14 more years. According to Chris Loftus, the director of communications for the Washington State Patrol crime labs, familial DNA analysis is being evaluated for use in Washington state. However, the Washington State Legislature has directed the labs to process the more than 9,000 backlogged rape kits in the state, placing the adoption of new techniques on the back burner for the time being. Furthermore, he maintains that familial DNA analysis presents legal, practical, and ethical issues for them to address, although the technique has not faced any major legal challenges despite widespread use in other states. Nicholas's trial began on April 17, 2023. His attorney, David Montes, based his defense of Nicholas on attacking two things: genetic genealogy and the witness testimony. He criticized the use of genetic genealogy in the case because it has only come into use so recently, although this critique did not explain how his client's DNA, which was compared directly to the crime scene DNA after he was identified using genetic genealogy, ended up on Sarah's body. Montes also argued that his client could not have been the man Drew Miller and his friend Adam saw just before they discovered Sarah's body, despite similarities between the composite sketch they helped develop and photos of Nicholas when he was younger. The boys told the sketch artist that the man they saw had uneven skin on his face, whether from acne, scarring, or dirt. Because Nicholas had clear skin at the time, Montes argued that he could not have been the man the boys saw, despite their testimony in court that they believed he was. It is also worth noting that the DNA found under Sarah's fingernails, as well as other evidence found at the crime scene, indicates that she fought fiercely against her killer. It is therefore possible that she may have scratched him on the face. While this is just a theory, the textured skin Adam and Drew reported seeing on Nicholas may have actually been scratch marks left by Sarah as she tried to fight him off. The trial went on for 2.5 weeks. Jurors deliberated for a day and a half before returning with a verdict on May 10, 2023. They had been sent into deliberation with 3 charges to consider: premeditated first-degree murder committed during the commission of an attempted rape, and the lesser charge of second-degree murder while also committing indecent liberties. They found Nicholas not guilty of the first charge, but guilty of the remaining 2. Nicholas's sentencing hearing was held on May 25, 2023. His lawyer argued for a sentence of 20 years in prison. Because the jury had returned a special verdict finding that Sarah's killing was sexually motivated, King County Superior Court Judge Josephine Wiggs instead handed down the sentence recommended by prosecutors, more than 45.5 years. This sentence all but ensures that Nicholas will die while incarcerated. Nicholas plans to file an appeal. While decades had passed between the time when Sarah was murdered and when Nicholas was sentenced, dozens of people connected to Sarah and to her case were present at the sentencing hearing. Anne Croney, who had been attacked by Nicholas in 1983, had not been allowed to testify at his trial, but came to give a victim impact statement. Sarah's family members and numerous friends also gave statements, detailing how the passage of time had not diminished the love they felt for Sarah, or the agony they felt over her loss. Frank Botts was a United States Marine and a veteran of World War II. During his time with the Marines, he was also stationed for a time at Camp Pendleton in Southern California. After completing his military service, Frank and his family remained in California, taking up residence in San Diego. Frank and his wife Elaine had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. Frank would take his son John fishing on a barge that was kept off of the coast near Oceanside. Frank and Elaine opened a small store, Botts Gift Shop, in the College Grove Shopping Center. On the afternoon of Saturday, April 2, 1977, a customer came into Botts Gift Shop, but no one was there to greet them. When they walked to the back of the store, they discovered Frank's body in the store's office. He had been stabbed to death in what would later be determined to be a robbery. He was 61 years old at the time he was killed. It would take 46 years and 5 labs in 2 states to finally solve Frank's murder. A renewed investigation into the case began in 2021. In the summer of that year, a match was found to a set of fingerprints collected from the glass counter at the gift shop when the scene was processed after Frank's murder. The technology required to adequately process these years-old fingerprint lifts had only been developed within the previous decade. Still, investigators hoped to find more corroborating evidence. They therefore used multiple labs to look for and process DNA evidence. A hat, which investigators describe as distinctive, had been found in the office along with Frank's body. It did not belong to him, and police believed his killer had lost it in the struggle that had ended with Frank's murder. One of the labs working with the investigators from the San Diego District Attorney's Office ultimately developed technology that allowed them to pull a DNA sample from the hat and match it to an individual whose DNA was on file. The DNA profile from the hat matched a DNA profile later extracted from scrapings taken from Frank's fingernails at his autopsy. The DNA profile belonged to the same individual, identified in 2021 as having left their fingerprints at the scene. In May of 2023, the San Diego District Attorney's Office identified the person responsible for the murder of Frank Botts as Norman Lamont Jones. Jones had been just 16 years old at the time of Frank's murder, but he was already 2 years into his criminal career. He would go on to have an extensive criminal record and be in and out of jail until 1991, when he was killed in an officer-involved shooting after a robbery at a store in the Fashion Valley shopping mall. Frank's son John has expressed relief both at finally having resolution to his father's case and at knowing that his father's killer had not been able to hurt anyone else after 1991. Joyce Casper was a generous, vivacious woman and the mother of 2 daughters and a son. She was loved by her children, as well as their friends. Joyce owned a drugstore and soda fountain in the Vista Village Shopping Center in Boise, Idaho. Her children's friends from the local junior high school would come in to have lunch there, and Joyce would dote on all of them. Decades later, they would still remember the affection she showed towards them and the attention she gave to them. By 1987, Joyce's soda fountain no longer existed, but 65-year-old Joyce still owned a business at the location on Vista Avenue. She was now the owner and operator of Casper's Vista Hallmark and Gift Shop. On the morning of October 13, 1987, Joyce's vehicle was found near some railroad tracks at Day Drive and Robert Street, just a few blocks away from her store. Her body was inside of the car. While evidence suggested to police that Joyce had been murdered, they could not determine the exact cause of her death. They were able to determine that she had been sexually assaulted. Joyce was known to be a hard worker who often kept very late hours at her shop. The doors to the store were locked when police went there after the discovery of her body. They believed she had been abducted outside of her shop as she left in the early morning hours of the 13th. She was then sexually assaulted and killed, with her body being found a few hours later. Those who knew Joyce could not fathom that someone would want to hurt her, and those who lived and worked around her shop were shocked that such a violent crime could occur in their neighborhood. However, a recent incident had placed Joyce in danger. Just a few weeks before she was killed, Joyce called police to report that she had been attacked in her store. A young man, believed to be between the ages of 17 and 25, with slicked back black hair, had attacked Joyce in her store, but had run off when she fought back. Police were not able to identify this individual, but after Joyce was killed, they feared he may have been the person responsible for her murder. Joyce's purse had been emptied and one of her credit cards was missing. There were no security cameras in the area of her store or where Joyce and her car were ultimately found, and no witnesses could be located. Nearly 150 suspects were investigated in the following years. Semen was found at the scene, and eventually DNA was extracted from it. However, no match to it was ever located in criminal databases. The case was formally reopened in 2017 for the 30th anniversary of Joyce's murder. 2 investigators were assigned to work on her case full-time. They submitted the DNA from Joyce's crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, who used it to generate an image of what the contributor of the DNA may have looked like. They found that the DNA profile was consistent with an individual who had dark hair and dark eyes and may have had Colombian or Puerto Rican ancestry. The image was released to the public, but no one called into police, reporting that they recognized the man in the image. In 2019, what would ultimately be a years-long effort to use genetic genealogy to solve the case began when a new detective assigned to the case started working with another company, Identifiers International. An extensive family tree was developed, and detectives looked into records of hundreds of individuals, trying to ascertain how they were related to Joyce's killer. They also collected DNA samples from numerous distant relatives of the killer, trying to figure out exactly where he would be situated within the family tree. Various social media sites and genealogical databases from all over the country were searched for leads. Investigators ultimately came into contact with a man who told them he had a half-brother who had lived in Idaho. They were able to get in contact with the half-brother's ex-wife in California. She had 2 sons with this man, but they were both homeless and difficult to contact. A detective did eventually find them in Los Angeles, and they provided samples of their DNA. Their DNA profiles confirmed that the DNA from the semen found at Joyce's crime scene belonged to their father. On July 7, 2023, the Boise Police Department announced that they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for Joyce Casper's murder as Frank A. Rodriguez. He had been just 17 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Rodriguez could not be arrested or charged with the murder because he had taken his own life in 2007. Rodriguez's family cooperated with police, and his mother is still alive. Boise Police Detective Paul J. Ghosh likened informing her of the DNA match to a death notification, based on how devastated she was to learn of what her son had done. The Boise Police Department is currently looking into the possibility that Rodriguez may have been involved in other unsolved cases. "26-year-old David Malcom hailed from Connecticut and was living in Ithaca, New York, while enrolled at Cornell University. According to Nina Miller, one of his co-workers, the sheer gentleness of the man made him very special. He also had a wonderful sense of humor. He was the best of what young people can be. He was idealistic, sensitive, warm, very bright. David has also been described by others as being wise beyond his years and a good role model. David dedicated much of his time to helping others. He worked at a Red Cross emergency shelter and at a suicide prevention network. On February 11, 1987, David worked a 24-hour shift at the Red Cross shelter, which was located on West Court Street in Ithaca. On the morning of February 12th, his body was discovered in the shelter's office. He had been stabbed to death. Police initially suspected that David had been murdered by one of his co-workers and focused their investigation on this man for years. The case was investigated throughout 1987 and 1988, and then periodically up until 2010. The case was formally reopened in 2015 in hopes of using forensic science to solve it. The Ithaca Police Department worked with the New York State Police Troop C Major Crimes Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Identification Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center, and the Tompkins County District Attorney's Office in the renewed effort. Following years of work, on May 26, 2023, the Ithaca Police Department announced that, based on DNA evidence and other investigative efforts, they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for the murder of David Malcom. However, they are choosing not to reveal his name to the public because he cannot be charged with the murder. He died in 2019. The exact source of the DNA that tied him to the murder was also not disclosed. According to investigators, David was killed by the boyfriend of a young woman who had come into the shelter where David worked for help. On February 11, 1987, a teenage girl from the town of Newfield came to the shelter following an altercation with her boyfriend, looking for assistance in being relocated somewhere away from him. Investigators believe that the deceased suspect came into the shelter looking for the young girl, and David refused to reveal where she was. According to the press release from the Ithaca Police, Mr. Malcolm's heroic actions for not disclosing the whereabouts of the young teen sadly cost him his life. Investigators from the Ithaca Police Department, Tompkins County District Attorney Matthew Van Houten, and Deputy Chief Vincent Monticello all met with David's family prior to the announcement that the case had been solved. They apologized for the fact that the case took 36 years to solve, attributing the family's long wait for answers to limited resources and the necessary technology being unavailable to them in 1987. Virginia Freeman, who went by the nickname Ginger, was an outgoing and personable woman with a bubbly personality. She was always smiling and loved working with people. She found a career that perfectly fit her personality as a real estate agent. While she was a natural fit for such a career because she could so easily work with the wide variety of clients she had, she was also very passionate about real estate, and according to her coworkers, her eyes would sparkle when she began talking about the ins and outs of the industry. In 1981, 40-year-old Ginger was working at Real Estate Mart in Bryan, Texas. At that time, all of the real estate agents there happened to be women. She lived with her husband Charles in neighboring College Station, Texas. Their son Brad was 11 years old, and their daughter Betsy was 14. There was nothing more important to Ginger than her family. Some of her coworkers mistakenly thought she worked part-time rather than full-time because she worked so diligently and efficiently while she was at the office that she was able to leave earlier in the day than most other employees. She worked so hard in order to have more time with her children. She built her demanding work schedule around her children's needs and did everything she could to be home when they arrived home from school. Ginger was very active and loved the outdoors. She regularly went hiking and backpacking with her family. What little free time Ginger had when she was not working or caring for her family was spent volunteering. She was an active volunteer at her church and with the Girl Scouts and the American Red Cross. Her love of nature helped her always come up with new ideas for outdoor activities for the Girl Scouts. She further volunteered to work with international students at Texas A&M University, helping them adjust to living in the United States. On December 1st, 1981, Ginger had plans to go out to dinner with her husband and two of their friends. However, around 3 o'clock that afternoon, a call came into her office. A man, described as having a country-sounding accent, said he had $73,000 in cash he wanted to use to purchase a home that was for sale on Greens Prairie Road. At the time, the home was on a secluded road in a rural section of College Station. Not wanting to miss out on a cash sale, which could generally be completed more quickly and easily than a financed sale, Ginger agreed to meet the caller at the property to show him the house. On her way, she stopped at home to see her children. She told them where she was going and that she would be back home in time for dinner. Ginger did not arrive home in time to go to the dinner. Around 7 p.m., her worried husband Charles reported her missing. He also called her office and got the address of the home Ginger had been going to show the potential buyer. He and the husband of one of Ginger's co-workers went out to search for her, starting out at the home she had been going to show that afternoon. Behind the remote home, they discovered Ginger's body. Ginger had been struck in the head with a blunt object, believed to be a 4.5-pound slab of concrete. She had been strangled with enough force that her neck was broken, and she had been stabbed in the neck 11 times. A later examination would determine that she had been sexually assaulted. Her time of death was placed at approximately 3:30 p.m., just a half hour after Ginger received the phone call that brought her to the property. The home on the property was still locked, indicating that Ginger was most likely attacked as soon as she arrived to the home. Marks dug into the dirt at the scene illustrated how fiercely Ginger had fought for her life. 2 days after the murder, a group of local real estate agents announced that they were collectively offering a $10,000 reward for information in the case. More than 900 people were in attendance at Ginger's funeral on December 4th, 1981. In February of 1982, a memorial fund was established in Ginger's name to help assist international students and their families when they arrived in Texas. On May 2, 1982, the Girl Scouts of Central Texas dedicated a secluded plot of land at their campground in Bryan, Camp Howdy, to Ginger's memory. The land was named the Ginger Freeman Primitive Area and is where young campers are taught to set up their campsites. Bo Ward, one of Ginger's co-workers at the real estate mart, would go on to use Ginger's story to teach new real estate agents about how to keep themselves safe while showing homes, particularly to clients they had not previously met. Even as decades passed after Ginger's murder, Bo could never bring herself to sell a home in the area where Ginger was killed. The early investigation was thorough and far-reaching, but did not identify a suspect that could be conclusively tied to Ginger's murder. Even as years passed after the murder, authorities did not give up on the investigation. Several known serial killers, including Coral Eugene Watts and Henry Lee Lucas, were interviewed as part of the investigation, but ultimately ruled out as suspects. More than 6 leads were pursued over the years, with investigators traveling all over the United States to look into potential suspects. Witnesses were hypnotized in hopes of them remembering new details. While DNA testing was not available to law enforcement at the time of Ginger's murder, investigator Dick Gullidge had the foresight to have Ginger's hands covered with plastic bags at the crime scene. He coordinated with the medical examiner's office to make sure that Ginger's fingernails and any material under them were preserved. Decades later, testing would show that the killer's DNA had been deposited under Ginger's fingernails as she tried to fight him off. The DNA would prove to be crucial evidence once technology advanced to the point where investigators could properly utilize it. Evidence from the case was submitted for DNA testing in 1997, and a DNA profile was developed. Over the years, there was no match to it found in criminal databases or to any of the numerous suspects authorities collected DNA samples from. A major break in the case came in early 2017 when the television program National Geographic Explorer offered to pay for advanced DNA analysis in the case in exchange for investigators' cooperation in filming a segment about Ginger's murder. The DNA testing in question was Snapshot, a forensic analysis program developed by Parabon Nanolabs. The program predicts certain physical features, like hair color and eye color, an individual is likely to have based on their DNA profile, and generates images of what they may look like. The analysis produced 2 images of what Ginger's killer may have looked like at different ages. Brazos County Sheriff Chris Kirk revealed the images at a press conference in April of 2017, with the hope that a member of the public would come forward identifying a man who resembled the man in the images, who could be investigated as a potential suspect. It would be Parabon's further work with the department that would ultimately help close the case, however. In June of 2018, Sheriff Kirk held another press conference, this time announcing that Parabon had used genetic genealogy to provide clear and convincing evidence that Ginger's killer was James Otto Earhart. Earhart could not be arrested and tried in connection with her murder, however, as he had been executed by the state of Texas on August 11, 1999. Earhart had been sentenced to death after being convicted of capital murder for the 1987 murder of 9-year-old Candy Kirtland. Candy was a 4th grade student at Crockett Elementary School in Bryan, Texas. She went missing on May 12, 1987, after being dropped off by her school bus near her home. Her body, still in the clothes she had been wearing the day she went missing, was discovered hidden under debris in a wooded area off of a dirt road in Bryan. Her arms had been bound behind her back with electrical cord, and she had been shot once in the back of her head. Earhart had been in Candy's neighborhood recently, inquiring about a paint gun that had been offered for sale in a newspaper ad. Witnesses saw him and his vehicle near Candy's home the day she went missing. He was taken into custody in connection to Candy's disappearance, just hours before her body was discovered. He claimed to have given Candy a ride the day she disappeared, but maintained his innocence in her murder. He was tried and found guilty, based on witness testimony and blood evidence. According to authorities, Earhart had been on their radar during the investigation into Ginger's murder. DNA evidence tied him to the crime after Parabon uploaded the DNA profile generated from the evidence found under Ginger's fingernails into genealogy databases. They then identified 2 women they believed to be the killer's second cousins based on the amount of DNA they shared with the submitted profile. They then researched the descendants of the 2 women's shared great-grandparents, one of whom was Earhart. A sample of Earhart's DNA had not been collected prior to his execution. His son agreed to provide authorities with a sample of his DNA, which showed that he was the son of the contributor of the DNA found at the crime scene. This led to the announcement identifying Earhart as Ginger's murderer. Earhart's remains were exhumed in June of 2018 to obtain a direct DNA sample. When the testing on that sample was completed in August of 2019, it confirmed that the DNA found under Ginger's fingernails belonged to Earhart. Nearly 38 years after Ginger was killed, authorities believed they finally conclusively identified her killer. "We are all elated to finally close this case," Sheriff Kirk said. "The one regret I have is that we weren't able to put handcuffs on the suspect and prosecute him for the vicious killing of Virginia Freeman." Ginger's husband Charles did not live long enough to see his wife's killer identified. Ginger's children were living in Austin at the time Earhart was named as their mother's killer. They released a statement thanking law enforcement for their dedication to their mother's case. At the beginning of 1972, 9-year-old Deborah Lynn Randall was a 3rd grader at Pine Forest Elementary School and living with her family in Marietta, Georgia. She loved playing with dolls, but was also known as the queen of her neighborhood baseball team. Her favorite person to play baseball with was Melvin, one of her 2 older brothers. On January 13th, 1972, 10-year-old Melvin was feeling sick. His mother, Juanita, was also not feeling well and had asked Melvin and Debbie to take the family's laundry to the Duds and Suds laundromat half a block away from their apartment building. Melvin did not want to go because he did not feel well, and his favorite television show was on. Therefore, Debbie and her stepfather, Frank, were the 2 people who went to the laundromat. Debbie put on a new pair of lavender shoes she had just gotten for Christmas and left home with Frank and the family's laundry. Debbie liked going to the laundromat because she had fun playing there. She would stack up empty detergent boxes, or bring her Barbie dolls and play with other girls from the neighborhood there. When she and Frank arrived at the laundromat, Frank started loads of laundry in 2 machines. He then gave Debbie the change she would need to switch out the laundry once those loads finished, and went home. Debbie's family expected that she would come home asking for help bringing home the laundry by 7:30. When she did not, they became concerned, especially since it was getting dark. Juanita and Frank went to the laundromat to check on her, and found a spilled box of detergent on the ground near a Volkswagen parked outside of the laundromat, roughly 85 feet away from its door. Debbie was nowhere to be found. According to some girls who had been folding laundry at the laundromat, Debbie had gone outside at 7:15, telling them goodbye as she left. It soon became apparent that Debbie had been abducted. Debbie's father, John, was notified while he was at his job at the Ford Motor Company plant. The Marietta police were called, and they found small fingerprints on the Volkswagen, smudged in a downward direction. Witnesses reported seeing a dark 1950s pickup truck speeding away from the area of the laundromat and driving erratically. Police eventually learned that a 12-year-old girl witnessed the actual abduction. She had not reported it immediately because she believed the little girl she saw a man grab must have been his child, who had misbehaved and was being taken home. The man nearly ran her over as he sped away, and she could briefly see him glaring back at her in the truck's rearview mirror as he drove away. Another witness saw a man driving a pickup truck, similar to the one later seen speeding away from the scene around 7 p.m., as it parked next to the Volkswagen where child-sized fingerprints were later found. These two witnesses were able to help develop a sketch of the driver. The official search for Debbie involved the Marietta Police Department, the Cobb County Police, and the Cobb County Sheriff's Office. In addition, the people of Marietta joined together to launch Operation Debbie, a massive search effort looking for the little girl. More than 4,000 people were ultimately involved in the search. Among the volunteers were civil defense workers, ham radio operators, and students. One of the most dedicated volunteers was Melvin Randall, who would struggle with guilt for several years over being sick and not going to the laundromat with his little sister the day she disappeared. He went door to door, speaking with all of his neighbors, and distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood, desperately hoping his efforts would bring Debbie home. January 29th, 16 days after Debbie disappeared, was cold and rainy, but the volunteers continued their work. A group of students from Southern Tech were searching a heavily wooded area between Windy Hill Road and the Fox Hill subdivision on Powers Ferry Road. Mike McCahon had enrolled in the school after serving with the military in Vietnam. He had been searching for several hours when he came across drag marks in the dirt around 5 p.m. When he followed them, he discovered Debbie's lifeless body. She was fully clothed, but had only her socks on her feet. Her prized lavender shoes were gone. Most of Marietta seemed to show up to honor Debbie's memory at her funeral. Thousands of people were packed into Roswell Street Baptist Church for the service. Debbie was then buried at Kennestone Memorial Park. Debbie's body was found approximately 6 miles away from where she was abducted. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab examined Debbie's body and determined that she had been raped. The most recent statements from authorities say that Debbie's cause of death was strangulation, but earlier ones state that she had been suffocated. It has been reported that Dr. Howard believed that Debbie died as the result of her killer using her coat to cover her face in an effort to muffle her screams while he raped her. A geologist was brought into the investigation to analyze dirt samples taken from Debbie's clothing. They identified dirt from 2 different locations, one from where Debbie's body was found, and another ultimately matched to clay from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road, some 3 miles away from where Debbie's body was found. This led investigators to believe that Debbie was killed on the Stone Company property, and that her body had then been dumped in the wooded area where it had been found. Brown hair was also found on Debbie's body, and the lab determined that it came from a white male, most likely between the ages of 18 and 30. Police conducted numerous interviews and followed up on hundreds of leads, but Debbie's killer remained unidentified. The death of Debbie and the lack of punishment for her killer obviously took a massive toll on her family. She was my baby, and I loved her so much. I couldn't understand why it was her instead of me. It was the way she had to go that hurt me so bad, and it still hurts. I would at least like to know who done it before I pass away, Debbie's mother, Juanita, said in July of 2018 as she battled leukemia. Juanita, unfortunately, did not get her wish to live to see her daughter's killer identified. She passed away on September 17, 2018. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were buried alongside Debbie's body. Describing what losing Debbie felt like to reporter Jessica Knoll in 2018, Debbie's father, John, tearfully said, "Somebody took my baby. It tears you up, literally tears you up. I was like a zombie around here for a while. It's just like taking a big chunk out of your body. When I found that out, it was just like losing a part of me being gone. It was gone, and it ain't never come back, and never will it come back." John participated in the interview with Jessica Knoll because he still hoped to live to see Debbie's killer brought to justice. He believed there were people who had information on the case, and he did the interview in hopes of one of them seeing it and coming forward. He believed that if Debbie's killer was still alive and could be prosecuted, he should be executed following his conviction, because he obviously was not sorry for what he had done, as evidenced by the fact that he had never come forward. Like his ex-wife, John died without ever seeing justice for his daughter. He passed away in January of 2022, just 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's murder. While he was not alive to see it, Debbie's case would finally be solved the very next year. By the times of their deaths, Debbie's parents at least knew that police were still looking for their daughter's killer, and that technology that had not yet been available at the time of Debbie's murder was being used to hopefully solve the case. Luckily, the original investigators assigned to Debbie's case had preserved the evidence from the case very well. What would prove to be the two most useful pieces of evidence in the age of DNA testing, the hair found on Debbie's body and a small piece of cloth found next to her body, were preserved well enough to still be usable for testing, even decades after Debbie's death. In 2001, the FBI conducted testing on the hair. They could not identify Debbie's killer, but the testing did narrow the suspect pool considerably. The case was handed over to the Cobb County Cold Case Unit in 2015. That same year, the evidence in the case was sent for more DNA testing. A partial male profile was developed, but a match to it could not be found in the combined DNA index system. Investigators with the Cold Case Unit developed several strong suspects, but each was ultimately excluded by DNA. Thanks to extra funding received in 2019, further advanced DNA testing was conducted on the cloth in 2022. A familial DNA profile was developed, and investigators used genetic genealogy to search for potential suspects. The Cobb County Cold Case Unit began working with DNA Labs International in 2023. They were able to identify several relatives of the contributor of the DNA from the cloth. When authorities contacted these relatives, they agreed to provide samples of their DNA. Comparing their DNA with the DNA from the cloth helped give investigators a better idea of how each one of them was related to Debbie's killer. The potential suspect ultimately identified by this effort was deceased. In order to be absolutely sure about the identification, authorities had his body exhumed so that samples could be taken for direct DNA testing. This testing confirmed his DNA was a match to that from the crime scene. On September 18, 2023, Cobb County District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. announced that Debbie's killer had been identified as William B. Rose, who had been 24 years old at the time of the murder. Rose could not be arrested because he took his own life in 1974, 2 years after Debbie was killed. Cold case investigator Roy Alter stated at the press conference announcing Rose's identification that he suspected Rose may have ended his life because he was afraid of being caught for Debbie's murder. According to Mr. Alter's conversations with Rose's family members, Rose had been worried about going to jail prior to his death, but his family had assumed his concerns stemmed from minor incidents. Rose did have a criminal record, but had only ever been arrested for alcohol-related incidents. He had not previously been a suspect in the case. It does not appear that Rose knew Debbie prior to her abduction. However, he did have relatives who lived in her apartment complex, giving him a reason to be a regular visitor there. He may have seen her playing outside during prior visits to the complex, but her murder appears to have been a crime of opportunity. Debbie's brother Melvin was present at the press conference to express his gratitude for investigators and their ongoing efforts. He was relieved both because he finally knew who took his sister from him, and because her killer was not someone his family knew. Melvin had ultimately resolved the guilt he had once felt for not being with Debbie at the laundromat that day, and he has stated that he does not hate Rose, despite what he did to his sister, because he had learned over the years that hating someone would do him no good. Melvin expressed sympathy towards Rose's family for the difficult time he knows they must be going through as a result of this news. Rose's identification was somewhat bittersweet for Melvin because his mother did not get to see it. However, he stated, "I wish my mother was here. but I know she knows in heaven that it's finally over. Teresa Scalf was an incredibly loving person. She turned that trait into a career, becoming a nurse and ultimately inspiring the majority of her family to also work in healthcare. In 1986, Teresa was 29 years old and working at Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center in Lakeland, Florida. She lived in an apartment with her 8-year-old son. On October 27, 1986, Teresa's mother Betty received a phone call telling her that Teresa had not shown up for her shift at the hospital. Concerned, Betty drove over to her daughter's apartment around 10:30 p.m. Teresa did not answer the door, so Betty used a credit card to manipulate the lock on the door and get inside. When she got inside, Betty discovered a bloody scene and her daughter's lifeless body. Fortunately, Teresa's young son was not at home. Teresa had been stabbed to death and nearly decapitated as a result of the depth of the wounds to her neck. She also had defensive wounds showing that she had fought back against her killer. While Teresa's fight to survive did not save her life, it would ultimately identify her killer. Teresa's case did go cold, but police did not give up on it, even after decades. Cold case detective Matthew Newbold was assigned to the case in 2015. He kept Teresa's picture in his office and promised her sister Pam that he would not retire until he solved the case. He was able to uphold that promise. On October 16, 2023, Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd announced that Detective Newbold had identified Teresa's killer as Donald Douglas. Douglas had been 33 years old at the time of the murder and had lived directly behind Teresa's apartment. He had been interviewed as a part of the routine canvass of Teresa's apartment complex, but had never been a person of interest in the case. He could not be arrested for the murder because he died of natural causes at the age of 54. He had never been arrested for anything during his lifetime. 2 types of blood had been identified from the crime scene, Teresa's and her killer's, because she had fought against him hard enough to make him bleed. DNA was extracted from that blood sample and run through the combined DNA index system sometime in the early 2000s, but no match had been found. Detective Newbold began working with Othram Inc. in 2022 to trace the unknown DNA through commercial DNA databases. Extensive genealogical work revealed that a third cousin of the killer had an affair with a neighbor in 1949, which resulted in the birth of a child. Tracing that child's family led to the identification of Douglas as a potential suspect. His remains had been cremated following his death, so Detective Newbold had no way to obtain a direct DNA sample from him or his body. Douglas did have a son, and Detective Newbold contacted him. The son was certain that his father could not have killed anyone, but was still fully cooperative with the investigation and provided a sample of his DNA. Analysis confirmed the biological relationship between him and the person whose blood was found at the crime scene. Douglas's son was shocked and horrified when he learned of what his father had done. Teresa's mother Betty did live to see her daughter's killer identified. "I'm 84 years old. I lived to see this done. I think that's why I lived so long," she said following the identification of Douglas. In 1981, 14-year-old Karen Alexander and her 13-year-old brother Gordon lived in the College Hill neighborhood of Texarkana, Arkansas with their parents and were members of Trinity Baptist Church. Karen was an 8th grader at College Hill Junior High School. She was a well-behaved student who loved spelling and English. She wanted to be a nurse when she grew up. Karen was very soft-spoken, but was incredibly kind and sweet to those she did talk to. She did not like to draw a lot of attention to herself, but had a few close friends. She enjoyed trading stickers and having sleepovers with them. Gordon was far more extroverted than his older sister. The 6th grade student at Washington Middle School had a gentle but outgoing spirit. He always had a smile on his face and said good morning to everyone at school. He was not simply loud, talking just for the sake of talking, but genuinely kind to everyone around him. He gave compliments freely too, and made an effort to get to know everyone he met. Gordon had dreams of one day playing football, despite a lifetime of health problems. These health concerns and their effects, like a special shoe he had to wear to account for a difference between the length of his legs, sometimes made him a target for bullies, but their actions did not tarnish his spirit. Gordon had been born with a congenital heart defect that required him to undergo open heart surgery as an infant. Later in his life, he suffered a stroke, which resulted in the left side of his body being weakened. In April of 1981, Gordon was confined to a wheelchair. He had broken his hip approximately 3 months earlier when he fell off his bicycle and was undergoing physical therapy. He and Curran spent the night of April 7th alone at home. Their mother, Vera, had been admitted to Wadley Hospital the previous weekend as a mental health patient. Their father, Weldon, worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at a local tire factory, Cooper Tire. Weldon called police at 7:15 a.m. on April 8th, telling them that he had come home from work to find his front door open and his 2 children having been attacked. His son was dead in the kitchen, and his daughter was on her bed near the living room, potentially still alive, but seriously injured. When police officers arrived 9 minutes later, Weldon told them that he had pulled a dull knife from Curran's body and placed it on a nearby bookshelf. Gordon had sustained 16 stab wounds and was deceased, but Curran was still clinging to life, despite the fact that she had been beaten, strangled, and stabbed several times in the face. It would later be determined that she had been raped. She was taken to St. Michael Hospital, where she remained in a coma until she died 3 days later. Her autopsy concluded that her cause of death was a stab wound to her right eye that struck her brain. The Texarkana police created a special investigative team to work the case, and they worked around the clock. All days off have been canceled. We will work full-time until this case is solved. The person who did this is an animal. We hope the courts will treat them as they would a mad dog, Texarkana Police Detective Jimmy Cowart said at the time. However, the case went cold despite their efforts. Henry Lee Lucas would later claim responsibility for the murders, but his confession, like almost all of the hundreds of confessions he made to garner attention and special treatment from law enforcement, was proven to be a lie. Gordon and Curran's mother, Vera, took her own life just 3 years after her children were killed, at the age of 37. Calvin Seward was a patrolman with the Texarkana Police Department who was assigned to the Alexander investigation shortly after the murders occurred. The case was a difficult one for him, as he had children the same age as Curran and Gordon, including a daughter who was one of Curran's classmates. Officer Seward was promoted to sergeant and then captain with the department before he retired from it in 2004. He went on to work with the U.S. Marshals and the Texarkana Airport Police for another 18 years before retiring again. Captain Seward had never lost his desire to solve Curran and Gordon's case. In February of 2022, he received permission to work on it on a volunteer basis. He conducted numerous interviews and reviewed several pieces of forensic evidence. He then began working with forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steffi, as well as Kelly Dixon, a DNA scientist at the Arkansas State Crime Lab. DNA testing had last been done on the evidence from the Alexander case in 2012, and the 3 of them agreed that the evidence should be retested based on advancements made in the field since then. DNA was found under both Gordon and Curran's fingernails, which had been preserved. DNA was also found in semen on Curran's bedsheets. This DNA was compared to Curran and Gordon's DNA profiles. Based on the amount of DNA the suspects shared with them, it was determined that the DNA came from their father. Further investigative efforts supported Weldon Alexander being his children's killer. Trace evidence was found on Curran's body and in dried blood on Gordon's hands. It contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which Weldon Alexander would have been exposed to at work at a tire manufacturer. Police had initially believed that the children had been killed while their father was at his overnight shift. However, Captain Seward's investigation revealed that this timeline was incorrect. He learned from the officer who first responded to the scene that Gordon's body had been cold to the touch when he arrived. Police had also originally believed that Curran and Gordon had let their killer inside and had been visiting with them before they were killed. There had been no signs of forced entry, and Police Captain Jimmy Cowart stated that he believed Curran had changed out of her nightgown and into a pair of shorts and a shirt because someone had come to the house after she had gone to bed. It was determined that Curran and Gordon had in fact been found in the clothes they had been wearing the previous day. Knowing all this, Captain Seward now believed that Weldon Alexander had attacked his children prior to leaving for work and called police pretending he found them like that when he returned from his overnight shift. It appeared that when Weldon began raping his daughter Curran, his son Gordon, despite being in a wheelchair, tried to protect her and was killed for his bravery. Weldon Alexander had died on November 6, 2014, at the age of 80, and as such, could not be arrested for killing his own children. However, Captain Seward and Dr. Steffi still submitted an affidavit of probable cause to the Miller County prosecuting attorney, naming him as the most probable suspect in the case. In a letter dated October 11, 2023, Miller County prosecuting attorney Connie Mitchell stated, "After reviewing your comprehensive report and meeting with you personally to discuss the case, your findings and theories, it is my opinion that Weldon Alexander, father to Curran Alexander and Gordon Alexander, is the sole viable suspect in their murder. I believe probable cause exists for the issuance of a warrant for 2 counts of capital murder. While this warrant could not be issued, finally having answers in the case will hopefully be beneficial to those who loved Curran and Gordon and never gave up on solving their murders." At the press conference announcing the resolution of the investigation, Police Chief Michael Cram stated, "It is our hope that the friends and remaining family of Gordon and Curran Alexander may find some peace in knowing that scientific and circumstantial evidence has been revealed sufficient to resolve this 42-year-old case." Robin Warr was a native of Syracuse, New York, where her father Robert had served as the city's first black city council member in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She grew up to be a strikingly tall and beautiful woman who was very athletic and enjoyed activities like tennis and biking. When she married for the first time, she lived in Connecticut, but she got divorced and moved to Washington, D.C. in the mid-1980s. 5 days after Christmas of 1989, Robin married again to a man named Ollie Lawrence Jr. The couple married in an intimate ceremony at their home on a wooded cul-de-sac in Springfield, Virginia, surrounded by poinsettias. 3 years later, Robin gave birth to their daughter, Nicole. Robin loved the arts and was a talented artist herself. A graduate of the Carnegie Mellon College of Fine Arts, she was able to incorporate art into her successful career. By 1994, she was the director of promotion and merchandising at Merchants Tire and Auto Center in Manassas, Virginia. Her husband Ollie was the vice president of human resources for U.S. Air, and he had to travel to the Bahamas for work on the Friday before Thanksgiving of 1994. That day, Robin went to work as usual. When she came home, she did some shopping with her 2-year-old daughter and then dropped her nanny off at a nearby metro station. Ollie tried calling Robin late that night after he arrived in the Bahamas, but she did not answer the phone. He called all throughout Saturday, but never reached his wife. He had been growing increasingly anxious over not being able to reach her, and had been in contact with Robin's friend Linda because he was so concerned. He called Linda again Sunday morning, starting to panic because he could still not reach his wife, and asked her to go check on her. Around 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, November 20th, 1994, Linda called police and drove over to Robin and Ollie's home with another one of her friends. When they arrived, the weekend's newspapers were still outside. When no one answered the front door, the two women walked around the house and onto the back deck, where they found an open window. They called in to Robin, but only 2-year-old Nicole came to the window. She was dressed in a sleeper, sucking on a pacifier, and exuding a smell that indicated that her diaper had not been changed in some time. Alarmed, Linda and her friend pulled themselves into the house through the window. Linda picked up Nicole and began walking throughout the house, looking for Robin. Nothing looked out of place until she turned into the hallway leading to the master bedroom, when she saw blood spattered on the wall and pooling on the floor. Linda and her friend fled the house with Nicole and ran to a neighbor's house to notify police about what they had found. Robin had been stabbed and slashed repeatedly. Robin's autopsy found that she had been killed on Friday night, just 5 days before her 37th birthday. Her daughter Nicole was unharmed, but had been left alone with her mother's body all weekend. Robin's brutal murder was a shock to everyone who knew her, and they all struggled to imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. She would be the last person I would have imagined this happening to. She was too nice for someone to hurt, Chris Wilson, one of her co-workers, said. Despite the fact that Robin's husband Ollie had been in the Bahamas at the time of the murder, he was still publicly identified by police as a potential suspect in the case. Police believed that Robin must have been killed by someone she knew in a targeted attack. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, indicating that Robin may have let her killer inside. Furthermore, nothing had been stolen, and Robin had not been sexually assaulted, eliminating common motives for murder. Police therefore believed that whatever the motive for killing Robin was, it must have been personal. Ollie was more disappointed than offended by police focusing in on him because he knew he was innocent. He was upset that so much time was being wasted on investigating him, when time continued to drag on with no actual movement in the case. Investigators were eventually able to extract unknown DNA from a piece of evidence found at the crime scene. The exact nature of this evidence has not been detailed to the public, presumably because of ongoing legal actions. No matches were found to the DNA in criminal databases, but in 2019, the Fairfax County Police Department began working with Parabon Nanolabs to use alternative methods to utilize the DNA evidence to track down the killer. Parabon was able to generate an image of what they believed the killer may have looked like, based on his DNA. They also began using genetic genealogy in the case, but it took 3 years of work for them to finally identify a potential suspect. Looking at this person's high school yearbook photo and a DMV photo taken 2 years after Robin's murder, investigators believed that there was a strong resemblance to the image generated by Parabon. They then traveled out of state to collect a sample of his DNA so that they could compare it to the DNA from the crime scene. The potential suspect was a man named Stephen Smirk. He was a 51-year-old married father of 2, living in Niskayuna, New York. 2 detectives traveled there to speak with him, and he happened to be taking out his trash cans when they arrived at his home. He consented to have a conversation with them and voluntarily allowed them to swab his mouth to take a DNA sample. When they left, detectives left Smirk with their business card. A short time later, before they could leave to return to Virginia, they got a call from Smirk saying that he had to speak to them right away. They told him to turn himself in at his local police station, which he did. There, he gave the detectives a full, detailed confession to Robin Lawrence's murder and was arrested. Smirk had been an active duty member of the Army stationed at Fort Myer, next to Arlington National Cemetery, at the time of Robin's murder. He had no connection to her, and the crime appears to have been random. The details he provided about the crime have not been made available to the public. Prior to his arrest for Robin's murder, Smirk had absolutely no criminal record. Smirk was extradited to Virginia and is being charged with second-degree murder. He is being held at the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center with no bond. Members of Robin's family, including her now adult daughter Nicole, were present at the press conference announcing Smirke's arrest. Robin's husband Ollie has since remarried and retired to the south of France. Smirke's arrest resurrected feelings of grief for him, and he was shocked that he finally had answers after so many years. He told the Washington Post by phone, "I was flabbergasted. You could have probably knocked me over with a feather. After all this time, you have hope, but you also wonder, will they really find someone after 29 years? Yvonne Leroux was the second of 4 children and lived with her family in Toronto. The family had moved there from Windsor when she was 3 years old. From a young age, Yvonne was industrious, brave, and very independent. She was always willing to stick up for what she believed was right. At the age of 15, her life took a bad turn. On July 1st, 1971, she took her younger brother to a fireworks show, where she ran into a male acquaintance. He offered to give her a ride home after he picked up 3 of his friends. Yvonne arrived home 2 hours after her brother, at 11 p.m. that night, in tears. She told her mother that she had been raped by the 4 boys. She made a report to the police, and charges were filed, but they were later withdrawn that December. According to Yvonne's mother Diana, the ordeal destroyed Yvonne's self-confidence and made her feel worthless. As a result, she began making choices that further tore her life apart. She began hanging out with a rough crowd and was introduced to the local drug scene. She ran away from home and was gone for months. However, by late 1972, Yvonne had returned and was getting her life back together. She began going to school again and found a part-time job. She also began going to counseling sessions. Yvonne was last seen after one of these sessions on November 29, 1972, at approximately 10 p.m. Her mother came to pick her up from the session at the now-closed York Finch Hospital and was told that Yvonne had already left. Later investigation would show that Yvonne was going to get a ride from a male friend who also attended the session, but decided at the last second not to accept it. Yvonne's body was discovered by a passerby the following morning on 16th Side Road between Jane and Keele Streets in King Township, approximately 15 miles north of where she had last been seen the night before. She had been murdered. Her autopsy found that she had died as the result of blunt force trauma to her head, and that she had died only about 15 minutes before she was found. Theories quickly sprang up concerning the motive for the murder. Yvonne hitchhiked regularly, so it was conceivable that she had simply accepted a ride from the wrong person. However, Yvonne had also been fearing for her life for several months prior to her death. During the time when she was caught up in drugs, she had gotten mixed up with a motorcycle gang. She told her family that the gang had threatened her because she refused to run drugs for them. Yvonne had gone to police to report the threats. The drug squad took the information she provided seriously, and her home was being watched by police for her safety at the time of her murder. Foot and tire prints were also found at the scene. Despite these clues and possible motives for the murder, the case went cold. On March 27, 2014, the Regional Municipality of York Police Services Board announced a $50,000 reward in the case, but it would be almost another decade before Yvonne's murder was closed. On November 15, 2023, 51 years after Yvonne was murdered, the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit announced that her case had been solved. They had used genetic genealogy to trace DNA from the crime scene to a man they identified as her killer, Bruce Charles Cantillon. Cantillon could not be tried for the murder, as he had taken his own life just 19 months after Yvonne was killed. Cantillon was 26 years old at the time of the murder and living in Toronto. He was very well known to police, and his extensive criminal career had begun when he was just 18 years old. He had been incarcerated for both mental health reasons and for multiple violent sexual offenses against women. Yvonne's family released a statement following Cantillon's identification, saying that Yvonne had never been forgotten, and detailing how her murder had affected multiple generations of their family. They also stated that they hoped more funding would be provided for investigative genetic genealogy in law enforcement, so that more grieving families can have some form of clarity. "23-year-old Laura Kempton had a vibrant and outgoing personality. She was a free spirit who loved socializing. She was also very hardworking. She worked 2 jobs, one at the Marco Polo gift store and the other at Curran's ice cream parlor, while she was enrolled as a student at the Portsmouth Beauty School. At 9:30 a.m. on September 28, 1981, a police officer arrived at Laura's apartment at 20 Chapel Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, tasked with serving her a court summons related to parking tickets she had failed to pay. When he arrived at her door, one of the door panels, near the doorknob, was missing. When he looked through the opening, he saw a pair of legs sticking out from a pile of bedding and called for backup. Laura had been killed as the result of massive blunt force trauma to the left side of her head. It would later be believed that she had been struck with a wine bottle. Laura had gone out with a female friend for dinner and dancing on the night of September 27th. The friend last saw Laura when they parted ways outside of Laura's apartment building shortly after 1 a.m. on the 28th. Laura's autopsy would indicate that she had been killed a short time later, most likely between 1:30 and 3:30 a.m. The autopsy also found indications that Laura had been sexually assaulted. Hundreds of leads were investigated in the following decades, but no arrests were made. Then, in 2022, the Portsmouth Police Department began working in conjunction with the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory, the Maine State Police Forensic Laboratory, the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and Identifiers International to see if genetic genealogy could be used to solve Laura's murder. Because of how well the evidence from the scene had been preserved at the time of the crime, DNA had been identified on Laura's body, on a cigarette butt, and on a pillow. By running this DNA through a commercial DNA site, they were able to identify a relative and then later the parents of the man to whom the DNA belonged. Unfortunately, this individual was deceased. Authorities still conducted further testing in 2023. A blood sample was taken at this man's autopsy, and testing of it revealed that his DNA was a match to that found on the evidence in Laura's case. On July 20th, 2023, New Hampshire Attorney General John M. Formella and Chief Mark Newport of the Portsmouth Police Department released a statement to the media identifying Laura's killer as Ronnie James Lee, who had been 21 years old at the time of the crime. Lee had no known connection to Laura, but he did have an extensive criminal record and was known to be in Portsmouth at the time of her murder. Lee had served in the U.S. Army until May of 1981, and then went to work for MBI Security at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth from July 1981 until August of 1982, when he was arrested by Portsmouth police on November 8, 1982, on an attempted theft charge. He provided them with his mother's address on Rock Hill Avenue in Portsmouth. He was linked to 4 residential and 1 commercial burglary in 1983 alone, and he pled guilty to 2 of them. In 1987, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman while burglarizing her home. He was incarcerated from December of 1987 until July of 1990 as a result. He died at the age of 45 on February 9, 2005, as the result of acute cocaine intoxication. While Lee cannot be prosecuted for Laura's murder, the Attorney General believes that the available evidence would have been sufficient to successfully obtain a conviction. "47-year-old Ralph Stutzman was a married father of 13 children who owned a farm in LaGrange County, Indiana. On August 17, 1952, he left his house to go out to his barn and never returned. Rumors about his disappearance swirled in his community for decades, which was very upsetting to his family. His wife, as well as several of his children, passed away without ever learning what became of him. On June 16, 2023, more than 70 years after Ralph disappeared, LaGrange County Sheriff's Detective Stephanie Mickham announced at a press conference that his case had been solved. Sometime after he vanished in Indiana, he moved to Florida, where he lived under the name Delbert Schrock and had 6 more children before passing away in 1968. In 2022, a woman given the pseudonym of Crystal in the press submitted her DNA to Ancestry.com in hopes of finding her biological parents. She believed she was a descendant of Ralph Stutzman of Indiana, but the site identified her grandfather as Delbert Schrock of Florida because his daughter Ruth had used the service and uploaded her DNA profile to their site. Crystal contacted a genealogist named Randy Davis to help investigate this unexpected result. After doing more research and realizing that Ralph Stutzman had disappeared before Delbert Schrock appeared in public records, Randy reached out to Detective Malcom to tell her he had a lead in a decades-old disappearance. She was initially suspicious, but did her own investigating into the Stutzman case. When she realized Randy may have been onto something, she requested that Ralph's daughter Mary provide a DNA sample. Mary's DNA sample confirmed that she and Ruth, the woman living in Florida, were half-sisters. Mary Stutzman Boyd is now 92 years old and suffering from memory issues. Her family does not believe she fully comprehends what has transpired, but they are relieved she finally has some answers about her father, even if she does not fully understand them. According to her son, Ben Boyd, who was just 5 years old when his grandfather disappeared, for years and years, she always said that she would like to know what happened to her dad before she died. I think for the whole family, it's just a relief to know what really happened to him, and that he's not laying in some ditch somewhere and deteriorating away. Ralph's reasons for leaving his first family remain unknown. Some members of the family he had while living as Delbert Schrock watched the press conference via Zoom, and were able to virtually meet the members of the Stutzman family, who were in attendance in person in Indiana. They were shocked by the revelation that the man they had known as Delbert had another family. Many members of both sides of the family hope to get together for a family reunion to meet in person sometime soon. On April 26, 2023, a farmer was digging a ditch on his farmland off Coxmoor Road, Sutton and Ashfield, Nottinghamshire, when he made a terrible discovery. Between 4 and 6 feet underground, he discovered human bones. Unintentionally, the farmer had just solved a 56-year-old mystery. Traumatic injuries to the skull led an anthropologist to determine that the bones belonged to a murder victim. Initial DNA inquiries made by police did not help them identify the remains. Then, they released images of a shoe and distinctive socks found with the remains, which were seen and recognized by a man named Russell Lowbridge. Russell contacted police, believing the remains may have been those of his long-missing grandfather. Russell and one of his uncles provided samples of their DNA, and testing confirmed that the remains were those of Russell's grandfather, Alfred Swinscoe. Alfred was a native of Pinxton, on the border of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. He became known as the champion pigeon man of Pinxton as a result of his love of pigeon racing. He went to work in the local coal mine at the age of 14. He was able to work his way up to one of the better-paying positions at the mine, but frequently gave away any extra money he had to friends and relatives in need. Alfred was married and was the loving father of 6 children. By 1967, 54-year-old Alfred was a grandfather as well. On the evening of January 27th of that year, he went out to the local Miners Arms pub with 2 of his sons and some friends. He was last seen around 10:30 p.m. when he gave his son some money to buy the next round of drinks, and then stepped outside to relieve himself. He never came back inside. While Alfred's entire family was distraught over his disappearance, his son Gary, who had been with him at the pub the night he went missing, was particularly affected by it. He spent decades reaching out to agencies, hiring a private detective, and performing searches of his own, going into abandoned wells and searching local fields. Gary shared his father's love of pigeon racing and continued the hobby well after his father disappeared. He unfortunately passed away in November of 2012 following a short illness, never getting the answers about his father's fate that he spent decades searching for. According to Russell Lowbridge, it completely broke him, never knowing what happened to his dad. I want justice for Gary because he tried so hard to get answers. It tormented him up until the day he died. The Swinscoe family plans to bury Alfred's remains alongside Gary, so that father and son can in some way be reunited. While Alfred's disappearance has been solved, the news that he was murdered has created new questions that now need answers. A murder investigation has officially been opened in the case. Alfred's family appeared on BBC's Crime Watch to appeal to the public for help. The coal mine where Alfred worked has since closed, and as it was a major employer in the area, a large number of people who lived there at the time of Alfred's murder have since moved. The family hopes that national media coverage will help reach former residents of the area who may have relevant information but now live elsewhere. Alfred's remains were found some 5 miles away from where he was last seen. According to investigators, this is an important detail because it indicates that his killer had access to a car, which very few members of the community did back in 1967. 4 of Alfred's 6 children are still living and desperate for answers about who took their father from them. Alfred's now 82-year-old daughter Julie told the press, "Someone, somewhere, will have some information, and we would urge them to get in touch with the police. We might be able to now give my dad the funeral he deserves, but we don't have the answers we desperately want. Someone killed my dad, and I want to know why. I need to know why." "84-year-old Philip Kahn was a retired cab driver who lived in a mobile home in Las Vegas with his wife, Jean. He had been born in New York City during the Great Depression and had lived in Florida for a time before ending up in Las Vegas. He was tall and tan and known to other cabbies as Stretch. He loved warm weather and swimming. He met Jean while they were both in their 60s, and they had been happily married for 20 years in 2000. On July 9th of that year, Philip left home around 7 p.m. A neighbor was giving him a ride to McCarran International Airport. He told Jean that he was going to Coral Gables, Florida, seeking holistic treatment for a physical ailment, believed to be an aortic embolism, because he did not want to undergo surgery for the condition. He never returned home, and Jean never heard from him again. She reported him missing to police after 12 days, with no word from him. Investigators would later learn that Philip liquidated his assets after leaving home. He had sent his sister some money and a letter, and signed over power of attorney to his wife. Airline records showed that he had not flown to Florida, as he had told Jean, but to New York City. His movements could not be traced further. Philip had not shown any signs of dementia prior to his disappearance. Jean died in December of 2007 at the age of 89. Never learning where her husband had gone. According to her daughter, Jean went through a variety of emotions, from anger to sadness, over her missing husband, but she did not fall apart after he disappeared, and lived her life to the fullest in her final years without him. It would not be until January 11th, 2023, that the resolution of his case was announced. That day, the State of Maine Office of Chief Medical Examiner issued a statement confirming that human remains found by the Coast Guard off the coast of Maine on July 24, 2000, had been identified as Philip Kahn. The remains could not be identified at the time they were found, so they were ultimately cremated and interred at Gracelawn Memorial Park in Auburn, Maine. Local authorities revisited the case over the years, but it was not until the FBI became involved that the interstate identification was made. They were able to match the fingerprints and dental x-rays taken of the unknown remains before they were cremated to one submitted to Philip's missing person file in Las Vegas. The identification of Philip's remains has brought on complex emotions for his stepdaughter, Jean's daughter, Judy Drago. She is perplexed over why Philip ended up in Maine. The news has also brought back up memories of her late mother. She feels at peace with the information she has now and is grateful that her stepfather's remains were laid to rest. She does not have any plans to have his ashes relocated. In 1930, the Moroni family of Chicago was going through a difficult time. The couple, Michael and Catherine, had 2 daughters, 2-year-old Mary Agnes and 11-month-old Anastasia, and were expecting their 3rd child. They had been affected greatly by the Great Depression, and what little work Michael could get was low paying. Michael therefore published a letter in a local newspaper describing his situation and asking for work. The Moronis did receive some support as the result of the letter. A man named Edgar Gilpin came to their apartment, which was above a grocery store on Wentworth Avenue in Chicago, and brought Michael a suit and a pair of shoes. Another individual came to the home on May 14th, looking to help the Moroni children. A woman, calling herself Julia Otis, arrived at the apartment, claiming that a social worker had sent her to see how she could help the family. She had gotten their address from the newspaper that had published Michael's letter, and arrived at their door with fruits and vegetables she had purchased at the grocery store downstairs. While she was there, the woman became taken with Mary Agnes, saying that she had always wanted a child just like her. The woman returned the following day, May 15th, 1930, this time bringing a large bundle of clothing for the Moroni's unborn child. She offered to take Mary Agnes around the corner to buy clothing for her as well. Catherine agreed to let Mary Agnes go with her. The woman never returned with Mary Agnes. The Moronis contacted the police and provided them with a general description of the woman, calling herself Julia Otis. She was approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, 125 pounds, 22 years old, and smartly dressed in a gray suit and a gray lace hat. The day after Mary Agnes was taken, her parents received a letter wrapped around a $5 bill from Julia Otis. In the letter, she said that she was taking Mary Agnes to California, but would return her in a few months, after Catherine gave birth and the family adjusted to having the new baby. She said she had hired a special nurse to help take care of Mary Agnes, and the little girl was being well taken care of. She promised to help the family get back on their feet, and told Michael and Catherine not to worry about Mary Agnes. They, of course, did not follow this advice. Chicago police searched train stations and interviewed individuals who worked on board trains, looking for any indication that Mary Agnes had been transported out of town. They also traced the baby clothes Julia Otis had brought to the Moronis to the Goldblatt's department store at Ashland and Chicago Avenues. The clothes had been paid for using a brand new $50 bill. The police also took Edgar Gilpin, the man who had donated clothing to Michael Moroni, into custody in case he had been involved in the plot to abduct Mary Agnes. Another letter came in the day after the first, trying to explain the actions of Julia Otis. The letter was signed Alice Henderson and claimed to be from a cousin of Julia Otis. The letter claimed that Julia's husband had previously passed away, and her child had recently died as well. The loss of her child had caused her to have a nervous breakdown. It again assured the Moronis that their daughter would be returned to them in a few months. 4 days after Mary Agnes went missing, her parents were able to secure a warrant from a judge charging Julia Otis with Mary Agnes's kidnapping. However, Julia Otis was not found to face these charges, and Mary Agnes Moroni was not found to be reunited with her family. The assurances of the 2 letters proved false, and Mary Agnes was never returned, no matter how many months passed. More than 20 years after Mary Agnes went missing, a Chicago newspaper claimed to have solved her case and reunited her with her parents. In 1952, the Chicago Daily News partnered with a newspaper in California, where Mary Agnes was believed to have been taken based on the letter from Julia Otis. The Oakland Tribune published photographs of various members of the Moroni family, which were seen by a man who believed they all looked very similar to his wife, 24-year-old Mary Beck McClelland. Mary had been adopted the year Mary Agnes was kidnapped. The Chicago Daily News arranged for a variety of tests, which they claimed did not exclude Mary McClelland as possibly being Mary Agnes, although the value of these tests is questionable based on current scientific standards. These tests included the examination of dental casts taken from Mary McClelland and members of the Moroni family by an anthropologist. The anthropologist claimed that genetic factors in teeth proved that Mary McClelland was in fact Mary Agnes Moroni. The paper arranged for Catherine Moroni to meet with Mary and declared the case solved on their front page. While the paper reported that Catherine believed Mary was her daughter for their story on what they claimed had been an emotional family reunion, the Moronis did not believe that Mary was their daughter. Mary did not have a birthmark on her cheek as Mary Agnes did, or a scar Mary Agnes had as the result of a surgery to repair a herniated navel. After meeting Mary, Catherine said that she was a wonderful person, and while she wished Mary was her daughter, she was not. Mary did become a friend of the Moroni family and stayed in contact with them. The media coverage in California also brought another woman who thought she could be Mary Agnes into the Moroni's life. She too became a family friend. In 2008, a DNA test conducted after Mary McClelland's death showed that she was not Mary Agnes, and 10 years later, DNA also proved that the other Moroni family friend was not Mary Agnes either. Catherine and Michael Moroni would go on to have a total of 8 children. Neither of them ever recovered from Mary Agnes's kidnapping. Catherine fell into a deep depression and died in 1962 at just 49 years of age. Michael died at age 58, with his last words reportedly being, "They never found my baby girl." Michael and Catherine both made their other children promise to never give up looking for their sister until they found her. As the 100th anniversary of Mary Agnes's kidnapping grew closer, cold cases were getting a lot of attention both nationwide and in Chicago specifically. In 2011, the office of Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart had undertaken a major investigation trying to identify John Does killed by John Wayne Gacy, successfully uncovering the identities of 3 of them in the next 10 years. In addition, the office's Missing Persons Project is working to solve cases of women who have been missing for more than 3 years, and whose cases are listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NamUs. One of the investigators assigned to the unit was Detective Jose Rodriguez. On June 10, 2022, Detective Rodriguez was tasked with investigating Mary Agnes's disappearance. He turned to the technique that was being widely used nationwide and had been successfully used in the Gacy investigation, genetic genealogy. Detective Rodriguez reached out to members of the Moroni family and learned that several of Mary Agnes's relatives had profiles on commercial DNA sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Some members of the family had hoped that these sites would help them find Mary Agnes on their own. When they learned that Mary Agnes's case was being reopened and that their DNA could help, another relative submitted their DNA as well. Their results all ultimately revealed a second or third cousin that none of them knew. Detective Rodriguez was able to get in contact with this individual, a woman named Lori Hart. She in turn gave them the contact information for her aunt, Terry Arnold, whose mother, Jeanette Burchard, was now being considered as potentially being Mary Agnes Moroni. Jeanette Damon spent the first 6 years of her life in Chicago, just 11 miles away from the Moroni family. She had been told that her date of birth was April 14, 1928, and that her father had died when she was just 2 months old. She was raised by her mother and later a stepfather. She was never abused, and, unlike many children growing up during the Great Depression, she never went hungry and always had anything she could possibly want. She was raised as a devout Catholic and received a good education. Her family moved to Virginia in 1934 and then to Florida during World War II. Sometime in the 1940s, she married Edgar Jennings and had 3 children. She and her husband divorced in 1961, and she remarried to a man named Earl Thomas Burchard in 1977. Earl died in 1989. Jeanette worked as a nurse for more than 50 years and loved the opera, particularly Madame Butterfly. She was also a fan of the Miami Dolphins from the day the team was established in 1966. Jeanette was a devoted mother who loved all of her children dearly. She would later become a grandmother, who was always there for her grandchildren. She was also very attached to her pets. She had all of her cats and dogs cremated, and their remains were buried with her when she passed away in 2003 at the age of 75. When Detective Rodriguez contacted Jeanette's daughter Terry, she was initially positive her mother could not be Mary Agnes Maroney. She could not imagine her grandmother being involved in a child abduction. She decided to take a commercial DNA test to prove the detective's theory wrong. However, when she received her results, they were not what she was expecting. While her mother's family was Polish, Terry's DNA showed that she did not have Polish ancestry. Rather, she was of Irish descent, like the Maroney family. Furthermore, the test identified Mary Agnes's nieces and nephews as her cousins. Terry's initial reaction was anger at her grandmother. It is still unclear how exactly Mary Agnes came into her custody and was raised as Jeanette. Previously, the family had no reason to believe Jeanette was not her mother's biological child. The only suspicious event in her life was an occasion when Jeanette's stepfather alluded to her not being her mother's natural child. He did not provide any other information. Jeanette contacted her cousins in Chicago to see if they had any information about this claim, but they had no idea why he would say this. Terry has been working through these complex emotions. She has been in contact with the Maroney family and is enjoying getting to know them. She has spoken to them several times over the phone and sent them photographs of her mother. She believes that had her mother been alive when the truth about her origins was revealed, she would have pursued a relationship with the Maroneys. She would have wanted to reassure them that she was alive and well and had lived a good life. Terry also believes that her mother would have loved being part of such a big family. While the DNA evidence seems to prove that Jeanette Burchard was Mary Agnes Maroney, the evidence is indirect. In order to prove this identification to an adequate legal standard, both Jeanette and Catherine Maroney's remains would need to be exhumed for direct DNA samples to be taken and compared. Terry Arnold told Detective Rodriguez from their earliest communications that she is not comfortable with an exhumation of her mother's remains. The Missing Persons Project also maintains that there are no remaining means of investigating how exactly Mary Agnes came to live with the woman who raised her as her daughter. Therefore, Mary Agnes's case does not fit the official criteria needed for it to be removed from NamUs. Even after police announced that the investigation was closed on February 3, 2023, the case remained listed in the database as the oldest case from Illinois. As the Maroney family accepts that Mary Agnes lived out her life as Jeanette, they consider it solved and are no longer looking for her. Investigators were apparently ultimately successful in using their acceptance as a means of getting the case removed from the database several months later. While Mary Agnes was never reunited with her family, the Maroneys feel that this resolution was still in some ways positive. Mary Agnes's nephew, Don Maroney, told the Chicago Sun-Times, "One of our hopes was that, when Mary Agnes was taken, that she led a good life and she was taken care of. And she was." Susan Preece lived in an old vicarage on a traveler's site in Pontefract, West Yorkshire, with her 6 siblings and her mother. Her mother struggled to raise her children on her own, and they were often temporarily placed in foster care. In 1969, a family of travelers from Scotland befriended 4-year-old Susan while they were staying on the site. The parents told Susan's mother, Maureen, that they were taking their 2 sons to Disney World for 2 weeks and offered to take Susan along with them. Wanting her daughter to go on a trip she knew she could not provide for her, Maureen agreed to let Susan go with them. At the time, a child Susan's age did not require a passport to travel from the UK to the United States, just their birth certificate and a parent's signature, which Maureen provided the couple. However, 2 weeks passed and the couple did not return Susan, as they said they would. Maureen would spend the rest of her life searching for Susan. She regularly visited various traveler sites, looking for the family who had taken her daughter, and frequently made trips back to the site where she had previously lived, long after she moved away. She passed away in 2014, without ever seeing Susan again. The couple had not taken Susan to Florida, as they had told Maureen they would be. Instead, they took her to Canada, then Australia, and New Zealand. Susan grew up being told that she was adopted after her biological family had disowned her. She enjoyed her life within the traveling community, and later said that the couple she was told had adopted her spoiled her rotten. Susan did not learn the truth about how she came to live with her traveler family until she was 16. The family traveled from Australia to New Zealand, and Susan did not need a passport upon entering New Zealand. However, she did need one to return to Australia. She went to apply for one, but the application required the signature of a parent. When she went to the man she called her father to get his signature, he tearfully admitted why he could not sign it. Susan's birth family had never disowned her, and he and his wife had never adopted her. They had stolen her from her family instead. The couple had 2 sons, and Susan later theorized that they had taken her because they wanted a daughter. Susan was shocked, but did not fully comprehend what her situation meant. She stayed in New Zealand until she could apply for a passport as an adult. She returned to Australia when she was 19, and went on to marry a traveler, becoming Susan Gervasi. She had 3 children, and eventually 4 granddaughters. She and her husband ran a charity for travelers. It was not until 2022, when she had a conversation with someone who had been adopted, that Susan processed how serious her abduction was. The woman asked her if she was curious about how her birth family was feeling about her being gone, and Susan experienced what she later described as a light bulb moment, realizing that her birth family may have actually cared for her and wanted to know where she was. Susan remembered where she had lived back in England, so her husband posted about her story in a Facebook group for the area. Within half an hour, her family had been found. Their efforts to find her had always been hampered by the fact that they did not know the surname she had been given by the couple who took her, or later, her married surname. When Susan was able to speak to her siblings on the phone, they were crying hysterically with joy at the news that she was alive and located. While her disappearance was solved and Susan was reunited with her family, neither of Susan's abductors could face any charges, as the woman, who had multiple sclerosis, passed away when Susan was still a child, and the man passed away when Susan was 21. In the fall of 2022, more than 50 years after she was taken from her family, Susan traveled back to England to be reunited with her siblings and celebrate her 57th birthday. While she was not reunited with them until after their mother passed away, the reunion came just in time for one of her sisters, who has Parkinson's disease and dementia. She was able to see Susan before her condition worsened to the point where she could not understand what was happening. Susan hopes her story will give strength to the loved ones of other missing people. It gives a message to anybody who has lost somebody that miracles do happen. There is hope, she said after her reunion with her family. One day in the summer of 1992, Bob Copta returned to his home in Ross Township, Pennsylvania, but his wife of 20 years, 52-year-old Patricia, was not there as he had expected. It was not uncommon for her to leave home for short periods of time without telling anyone, but he ultimately reported her missing. In school, Patricia had been a straight-A student who worked as a model and a dance instructor. After graduating from high school, she continued dancing by attending weekly ballroom dancing events and took a job working in finance at a plate glass company in Pittsburgh. She met Bob Copta near a river in Pittsburgh, and he offered to give her and the friend she was with a ride on his boat. Bob and Patricia fell in love and married in 1972. By the time she disappeared in 1992, Patricia's life had become far less idyllic than it once had been. She had resigned from her longtime job at the glass factory because she suffered from migraines, which her doctors told her were the result of stress. She then went to work as an elevator operator at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. While she was employed there, her family began noticing concerning changes in her behavior. It was at the Art Institute where she claimed to have started receiving visions, saying she had seen an angel while she was there. Patricia then soon became a well-known street preacher in the area, dubbed the Sparrow because of her small build. She frequented parking lots and busy streets in Ross Township, as well as concert venues and stadiums in Pittsburgh, preaching to people as they walked or drove by. She preached about her religious visions and tried to warn people about the end of the world, which she believed to be imminent. Patricia was briefly institutionalized prior to her disappearance. Doctors at the facility diagnosed her as having delusions of grandeur and stated she was showing signs of schizophrenia. Patricia was afraid of being placed in an institution long-term, so when she went missing, police theorized that she had voluntarily disappeared to prevent this from happening. Patricia's family and the police tried every avenue of investigation open to them. They even went so far as to consult a psychic to try to find Patricia. However, they could not find any trace of her. After Patricia had been missing for 7 years, she was declared legally dead. More than 30 years later, Patricia's shocked surviving family members were present at a press conference on March 3, 2023, during which Ross Township Police Department Chief Brian Coleheb announced that Patricia's disappearance had been solved. She had been found alive, living in a nursing home in Puerto Rico. Patricia being in Puerto Rico made some level of sense to her family. She had previously vacationed there multiple times with friends before she got married, and had talked about wanting to travel there again because she enjoyed the climate. Bob Copta had even taken out newspaper advertisements about his wife's disappearance there, in hopes that someone on the island had seen her, but he never received any information from the effort. While Patricia's location was logical enough to her family, they were still shocked to learn that she was still alive after 3 decades. Patricia's twin sister died without knowing what happened to Patricia, but Patricia's husband Bob and younger sister Gloria finally learned her surprising fate. Patricia had been in Puerto Rico since at least 1999, around the time she was declared legally dead back in Pennsylvania. She had been wandering around several towns in the northern part of the island. She was found living on the streets and identified as a person in need. This allowed her to be placed in a care home for adults. At the time, she would not reveal any details about her past or her identity. At one point, she hinted that a cruise ship from Europe had brought her to Puerto Rico. Patricia developed dementia years later, which led to her, perhaps inadvertently, revealing more details about her origins to her caregivers in passing. They were eventually able to piece together enough of the random pieces of information to find Patricia's case back in Pennsylvania. They contacted authorities there, and DNA samples provided by Patricia's sister and nephew confirmed that the woman in Puerto Rico, who now required more intensive care in a nursing home, was Patricia Copta. Since Patricia was located, Bob Copta has stated that he is relieved that his wife was not murdered or otherwise harmed. He is also happy that she is being taken care of so well in the nursing home. In the decades since Patricia disappeared, he would always fear that his wife had been killed and her body had been found, any time he heard about police finding human remains on the news. He never remarried, even after Patricia was declared legally dead. However, he has no plans to visit Patricia in Puerto Rico. Patricia's sister Gloria does plan to travel to Puerto Rico to see her, even though she understands that Patricia will most likely have forgotten her due to her dementia. Whether she knows me or not, I still want to see her and give her a hug and tell her I love her. I thought maybe she had died, Gloria said at the press conference. "28-year-old Judith Bellow lived on Saratoga Drive in Stanwood, Washington, with her husband and 3-year-old son. She was employed at the National Food Corporation in Savannah. It was at work where she was last seen on December 13, 1993. She left the facility at 9:30 that morning and was not seen again. She did not pick up her son from daycare and did not return to her home. Her car was later found abandoned at the post office in Stanwood. Police investigating her disappearance did not believe that she had left voluntarily because she would not leave her son behind, and she was very close with her siblings. They believed that she had most likely been the victim of foul play. Their investigation did not locate Judith or her body, and her case eventually went cold. Years later, Judith was featured as the 8 of Hearts in a deck of playing cards issued by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. Each card in the deck featured an individual who was the subject of an ongoing cold case investigation, including missing people and murder victims. The decks of cards were distributed throughout the community in hopes that someone with information about one of the cases would see them and call in a tip. A tip did later come in, finally solving the case. However, it did not come from a witness. It came from Judith Bellow herself. On November 23, 2011, a woman claiming to be Judith called the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department and left a message stating that she was alive and living in California. In the following weeks, the Sheriff's Department investigated this claim and ultimately determined that the woman who contacted them was, in fact, Judith Bellow. According to Judith, she had voluntarily disappeared because of serious problems in her marriage. She had cut off contact with her family because she was afraid of her husband and feared her siblings would face harassment from him if they knew where she was. She left Washington State in August of 1994 and was living in California when she saw her case on the Sheriff's Department's website. Since she left Washington, she had given birth to 3 more sons. Judith was not the only relative her family had spent years looking for. 3 months after Judith disappeared, her husband had abruptly left town with his and Judith's son, cutting off contact with Judith's family. They did not hear from Judith's son until he was a teenager and chose to reach out to his mother's family on his own accord, contacting his maternal grandmother in Mexico shortly before she died. Judith's siblings were ecstatic to find her and to learn that they had 3 more nephews. Several of her brothers began making plans to go to California to spend Christmas with Judith and her sons once the Sheriff's Department put them in contact with her.